What is up, guys? It's your friendly neighborhood web war fanatic, and today we're going to be ranking all the villains in Marvel Champions in terms of their difficulty, and this would be a list that encapsulates everything. So in terms of the multiplayer or a standard and expert, just kind of their overall difficulty in my opinion. And this will include the Age of Apocalypse, the new 5 villains that came in that box. So it is June 2024, and it's going to have all the villains up to there. So let's go ahead and get started here with the core set. And we're going to start off here with Rhino. So he's the first villain that came out in the core set, and we have some of the stuff pulled out right here on Hall of Heroes. So Rhino is the first villain that you're going to usually face in the game. He's the first villain that I face in the game. He came in that core box, and he is one of the most simple villains in the entire game. So you see his scheme stat is going to be 1 on every single stage, and he goes from 2 attack to 3 attack to 4 attack. 4 attack is actually pretty decently high for an attack stat for a villain on their third stage. So he does start to hit pretty hard, which I think fits Rhino, but he's kind of a dumber character, so that's why his scheme is only 1 all throughout. And then the one interesting thing about Rhino is that he doesn't have any boost effects in his recommended module sets or in his encounter set. So all of his cards here have boost icons or no boost icons, but there's no boost effects. And I think that kind of translates to how dumb that they want Rhino to play and how of a simplistic type of character that he's supposed to be. However, I think because of that, he's not the best tutorial villain in Marvel Champions just because you aren't really introduced to those boost effects. And then the biggest thing to know about Rhino is that his main scheme here, he only has one main scheme that flips at 7 per player, which is actually pretty low. So multiplayer is not going to be that bad because per player means it's going to be times 2, times 3, depending on how many players are playing. But in solo here, he can be pretty difficult because 7 threat on the main scheme. I mean, he can easily flip that out with one big scheme in addition to an advance or something like that. So he's definitely not the easiest villain in the game, but definitely not very difficult either, just because he is such a simple villain. So for our first villain in the game, we're going to put him in the C tier here. He's definitely on the easier side, but not one of the easiest villains in the game because of that low threat threshold on only having one main scheme. Okay, so the second villain in Marvel Champions is the second villain in the core box, which is going to be Klaw right here. So let's pull up Klaw on the Hall of Heroes. So Klaw's right here. He has 2 scheme, and then 3 scheme on his third and final stage, and then his attack is going to be 0, 1, and 2. So he's kind of the opposite of Rhino. He's more of like a smart cerebral type of guy, so he actually ends up having pretty high scheme. And he starts off with 2 scheme, which is pretty high for a first stage. And his attack is a little bit lower here, only being 0, 1, and 2. But he has his Force Interrupt, so it's forced, so you must trigger it when Klaw attacks, give him 1 additional boost card for his activation. And he has this effect for all 3 stages here. So because of that, I think that Klaw can hit very hard. He has a very high variance, right? If he gets 2 boost cards of 0 boost icons, he could be hitting you for just 0 attack. If he gets 2 high boosts, then he could be doing like, some boost effects or a lot of damage. So he's a very high variance. For that purpose, he's not my favorite tutorial type of villain either. I think he can be very difficult, especially on expert. He can be a little bit easier on standard though. But yeah, I mean, I think that Klaw is a decent challenge in a kind of very middle ground type of villain. So I'm going to go ahead. He doesn't really have any other crazy gimmicks or anything like that. He does have a lot of boost effects in his kit, right? Like the boost effect here, put the weapons runner into play, engage with you. Sonic Boom is activation, deals damage to you, exhaust your hero, right? There's a lot of boost effects in his kit. And you kind of have to plan around him a little bit more when you're facing him compared to just Rhino. So I'm going to put Klaw in the B tier. I think to this day, he's still going to be a decent challenge in the game. He's never going to be like a cakewalk. So beating Klaw is still always going to be, it's going to take a little bit of thinking. It's going to take a little bit of strategy. So I think he is always going to be a fair challenge. For a third villain in the core box, there's going to be Ultron here. And Ultron is the most difficult villain in the core set. Okay, so we have Ultron right here. And Ultron is very, very thematic. So the way Ultron works is he really revolves around having his drone minions. He has a permanent environment right here called the Ultron Drones. And basically each face-down drone minion engaged with the player has a base scheme of 1, attack of 1, and base hit point of 1. And then Ultron will grab your cards and put him in front of you as a drone minion to attack yourself. So he can really swarm the field with a bunch of drone minions, and you really need to have some sort of minion control if you want to deal with Ultron. Other than that, I mean, he has a force response here and a force interrupt, where basically whenever he attacks you, you can either put threat on the main scheme or put the top part of your deck into play, engage with you as a drone minion. For stage 2, you have to trigger it, so you have to get that drone minion, and he has so many ways to just build out and get more drone minions here. It really feels like he's swarming in on you. And then for his final stage here, he has 2 scheme and 4 attack, which is a pretty respectable stat line. And he is a very strong villain, and he can't take damage while there's any drone minions in play in his final stage right here. So for Ultron, I think he's definitely going to be an A tier villain, even to this day. Even though he's one of the original villains that came out in the core set, he's still one of the toughest challenges in Marvel Champions to this day. So I think he definitely deserves to go in A tier. He's not going to go in that S tier villain where it's like, you know, cream of the crop, like above the rest, but he's definitely going to be a challenge even with the newer heroes and newer decks. I don't think there's too much power creep in Marvel Champions, at least with I've been playing it. So I mean, the core box villains I think still stand test of time. Rhino's definitely not the weakest villain in the game. Klaw is still a good challenge, and Ultron is a very tough challenge still here. So next we have the Green Goblin scenario pack, which was the first scenario pack introduced in Marvel Champions. So Green Goblin comes with 2 scenarios. It has the Risky Business scenario, which we're going to look at first here. So Risky Business has Norman Osborn here, and then he's kind of the first flipping villain, so kind of like a hero. He has his alter ego here in his villain side. And whenever he changes to the villain side, his one review effect will trigger where he deals 3 indirect damage to each player in hero form. And then on stage 2 here, he deals 4 indirect, and on stage 3 he deals 4 damage to each player, and it's no longer indirect, so it just goes straight to your identity. So yeah, I mean, he kind of schemes a lot in his alter ego, and he hits pretty hard in his hero form. But he's a villain that you can really game. You can just stay in alter ego or keep him in his alter ego the entire game, so he's never attacking you, and just play around that and mitigate the threat. And there's ways for you to play around his flipping. That being said, I do think in expert mode he can be a bit of a challenge because he is scheming for a lot and he's hitting for a lot. And then if you are flipping him multiple times to his Green Goblin stage on stage 3, taking 4 damage to each player, that is nothing to sneeze at. That is a lot of damage to a player that can definitely build up. So I do think he's definitely one of the more easier villains in the game. I'm going to put him, I think I'm going to put him in the D tier here. Yeah. He still can be a challenge if you're not properly playing for him, right? If you're just gunning him straight down, he can still take you down. But if you just prepare a little bit and then make sure that you're not flipping him straight away to Green Goblin and attacking him stuff, then there is a way to kind of prepare and make the scenario a lot more easy. But I think he can be a challenge on expert mode. But I think overall, especially taking in standard, he's going to be a D tier level villain. Next we have the Green Goblin Mutagen formula. So that's the other scenario in this scenario pack, and that's going to be this one. Whoops, let me click on it again. That's going to be this one right here. So Mutagen formula, Green Goblin only has one side, right? He's no longer a flipping villain. He's Green Goblin stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. And then this is going to be a little bit harder one for me to judge. So basically, I think that he ramps really hard from standard to expert mode. So with Green Goblin here, his one revealed, he doesn't have one on stage 1. On stage 2, his one revealed is to do 2 face down encounter cards to each player. And then on stage 3, you do 3 face down encounter cards to each player. So if you're starting on expert mode, you start the game off on stage 2 right here, so you already have those 2 encounter cards. Whereas if you're playing on standard, you start off with basically nothing. And you can game it to where you never deal with those encounter cards because you burst down his 18 hit points here on stage 2 in one go. Right? And you can easily do that on multiplayer as well. But if you're playing him in on expert, then you have to take these encounter cards, and you may be taking even more encounter cards if you have to review these cards on stage 3 here. So I think that he's a little bit of a hard villain for me to track because I feel like he's very, very easy on standard, but on expert mode, he kind of jumps to a pretty difficult villain. And he does have 2 main schemes here, so the threat threshold is pretty high, and you don't have to worry about that too much when you're playing with him. And his big mechanic is just swarming you with goblin minions here, right? So he has all these goblin soldiers, it's a goblin knight, goblin thrall minions, and he just kind of swarm the field. A lot of the encounter cards put those minions into play, engage with you. And he does have some decent scheme where he adds threat after he attacks and damage you. You have to put a threat on the main scheme. So he could be pretty difficult with that. So for Mutagen formula Green Goblin, I think that if we're talking about expert mode, he's probably definitely going to be in a B tier, probably more difficult than Klaw. So I put him like probably here. But if we're going to take overall, like standard and expert and in multiplayer, I think he does drop a little bit. So I think Claw is definitely harder, taking everything um, into consideration. And Green Goblin, I think he's still going to be a decent challenge because on expert mode, you do get those encounter cards, right? So I'm going to put him in the B tier here, but not as difficult as Claw, especially I think in standard. I think that's where he becomes a very two-dimensional type of villain, the Green Goblin. Okay, and next we have the Wrecking Crew here. Okay, so Wrecking Crew is our first, or Fantasy Flight Games' first like multi-villain that they introduced in the game. So it comes with 4 villains here, right? The Records is his side A for standard and side B for expert. Thunderball, Power Driver, and Bulldozer as the 4 different villains. So this scenario is pretty easy. They do just kind of, it's pretty simple in how it plays out, even though it can feel overwhelming. Each time whenever the villain attacks, they have some sort of trigger, right? So the Record, when he's attacking, he gets +2 attack. If the attack is undefended, Power Driver deals 1 damage to each character you control whenever after he attacks. And then, or sorry, not Power Driver, Thunderball, I mean. Power Driver here has Retaliate 1, which can be very annoying. Whenever he schemes, you place threat on the side scheme instead of the main scheme. Oh, they all have that effect, by the way. And then, because there's like different main schemes that, or side schemes that fit for each one of the Wrecking Crew members. And then Bulldozer here, whenever he attacks, the attack gains overkill as force interrupt, which can be hard, or it can be a little bit difficult to like mess around with. And there's 1 main scheme here, but they each have their own side scheme, which they put threat on, and then their cards like trigger with their own effects. So there's a lot of combos that go on with there, and it can be a little bit complicated of a scenario, but overall in difficulty, I don't think it's the most difficult scenario in the game. Definitely one of the easier ones. So I'm gonna put him about, I think they're also about Rhino tier, but on standard, I think they get a lot easier. So I think I'm gonna actually put them here in the D tier, and I'll put them easier than Mutation Formula, because I think on expert mode, or not Mutation Formula, this is a risky business Green Goblin, but I think that on expert mode, the risky business definitely ramps up a little bit more than the Wrecking Crew. Even the Wrecking Crew can also be a little bit of a challenge on expert mode. They're both still more the easier, like in line of being one of the more easier scenarios in the game. So I'm gonna put them still both in D tier, but I mean, in expert mode, they could be a challenge. Just overall, taking in standard as well, they're definitely be here in the D tier. Okay, so next we have the next 5 villains are going to be the villains in the Rise of the Red Skull. Okay, so first we have Crossbones. He's the first scenario of this expansion, and Crossbones, I think he's also pretty straightforward. He has a lot of he has a weapons mechanic here, right? So he has his own weapons deck where he has a bunch of these guns, like for example, Crossbones machine gun. It's also one of his guns, I think, or is this? No, this is in the Crossbones set. But I think he starts the game with the machine gun. Yeah, if you face him on expert mode. On standard, he doesn't, but then he has like his weapon deck, which is a separate modular set that you constantly put into play. And then, depending on the amount of weapons that Crossbone has on him, he could be really, really nasty, right? He has weapons attachments and his attacks gain piercing as well. And then he has this really nasty card here. Where is it? The full auto card. Where if it's reviewed in hero form, let's read it right here. If this card is reviewed in hero form, you discard X cards from top of your counter deck, where X is equal to his attack. Take 1 indirect damage for each boost icon discard this way. Okay, just kidding. This is not the rare difficult card that I was talking about. This could still be annoying by taking a lot of indirect damage. But let me see. The card that I was talking about is, he has a card that gains Surge. If he has a weapon upgrade, where is it? Give the villain. I'm not sure where that card is actually. It could be from his modular set. Discard cards from the encounter deck. Let's check the modular sets here for the Rise of the Red Skull. Okay, so we have, oh, it's gonna be this one right here, the Weapon Master. So that's gonna be in the Weapons Master modular set, which is a part of the, which is recommended. I think it might be required whenever you're playing Crossbones. But when you get this treasure here, the Weapon Master, when reviewed in hero form or when reviewed in alter ego form, the villain will scheme or they'll attack. And if they have a weapon attachment, this card gains Surge. So that's super duper nasty to get a villain activation in your encounter phase, and then you also Surge this card, so you get another card on top of it. So that could be really bad, and he has a lot of these weapon attachments here. And let's just double check on Crossbones really quick to make sure what's recommended in the set and what's required. So right here, we create the experimental weapons deck, and then let's see, Yes, so experimental weapons is required whenever you're playing it. Weapon Master is actually not. It's one of the recommended sets, so you don't have to play him with that set. So actually, I'm kind of just, um, evaluating him as if we are playing him with that set. But I think if you're not playing with, these weapon type of sets right here, he could be a lot easier if you're not playing with Hydra Patrol and the Legions of Hydra, because I think those modern sets are actually a little bit more difficult and they add on to its difficulty. So they're recommended, but they're not required. The only required set is going to be the experimental weapons here. So Crossbones overall, I mean, I didn't really talk too much about his difficulty. I think he's still a fairly difficult villain on expert mode. On standard mode, he becomes a lot more easier. And I think that even on expert mode, he's not going to be the most difficult villain. I think he definitely goes in the C tier. Still one of the easier villains because he's just very straightforward, and you can pretty much like rush him down pretty easily, even in multiplayer. I'm gonna put him here. I think he's more difficult than Rhino. Uh, yeah, because we're really taking him on expert mode and in multiplayer, right? Rhino gets a lot easier in multiplayer, and his difficulty is usually going to be in solo because of that low threat threshold on the main scheme. But Crossbones, I think, can be hard throughout all player counts if you're letting him build those weapon attachments and just kind of ignoring them. Okay, so next we have Absorbing Man. He's the second scenario in the Rise of the Red Skull. And Absorbing Man is pretty notorious for being one of the easier villains in the game. I think I'm definitely going to put him, especially for standard, if we're evaluating him on standard as well as expert. I mean, his standard stats are not very high at all. I think Azorming is also a very, very straightforward villain. He's going to go in the D tier here. And I think I'm going to put him actually as the easiest villain that we've seen so far, even easier than the Wrecking Crew. On expert mode, he can hit pretty hard. And there are things that he can do to make the scenario a little bit more difficult because he has a lot of triggers, right, based on if he has these traits. But on standard, he doesn't really have anything to start off with. Only one scheme, one attack, or two attack is very, very low. And he has one main scheme, but the threat threshold is pretty high. His mechanic, where he tries to, he does stuff like his trait changes based on what the environments that's in play, right? So the dense forest, then he'll get the wood trait. If he gets this one, he has the ice trait, stone trait, and metal trait. And then it's a lot worse if you're facing him where he has force responses whenever he's activated against you based on the traits that he has, right? So for his third stage here, if he has an ice or stone trait, you have to place one threat on the main scheme each time he activates against you. And then if you have the metal or wood, you have to take indirect damage every single time. It's still not going to be that bad, but it could accumulate over time if you're leaving those traits on him. But on standard mode, I mean, he's just super duper easy. So I think he's definitely going to be the easiest villain so far. Next, we have Taskmaster. So this is the third scenario of the Rise of the Red Skull expansion. Taskmaster, I think, is also a villain that has a pretty high variance because his stats are so much higher in expert mode compared to standard, right? I mean, his variance throughout standard and expert. On standard, I think that Taskmaster is kind of a pushover, right? He has very, very low stats, one scheme, two attack, and you can get these Avengers captives here to help you out. Actually, they're not Avengers, are they? Yeah, they're just like the hero for hires, I guess, is their trait. But basically, when you're facing him, you can get this side scheme here. Where is this? Captured by Hydra. And if this side scheme comes out and you clear it, you can get one of the random sets like captive allies, and you get it in your hand. So that's going to be, either Moon Knight right here, or Shang-Chi, or White Tiger, or Elektra, right? So if you get these allies, they have very, very powerful effects, right? Like after you play Moon Knight from your hand, you can spend a wild resource, so you can draw two cards, which is very, very good. And he's a zero cost ally, so it's free to play. 2 Thor, 2 attack, 3 hit points is a very, very strong stat line, right? So yeah, I think that makes the scenario super duper easy. And even on expert mode, it's gonna make the scenario more easy. But on standard, I mean, he is super duper easy. So I think Taskmaster, I'm gonna put him. I think last here in the C tier. He's definitely a pretty easy villain, but I think if you're calculating him on standard, he's definitely going to be way easier. If he's on expert, maybe he'll go more towards the higher end of C tier. But yeah, overall, he's still definitely a pretty easy challenge. Next, we have Zola here. Okay, so Zola is kind of where the Rise of Red Skull kind of ramps up a little bit. He's kind of known for being a much more difficult villain because every single stage here has a Retaliate 1. So I think he's the only villain in the game that has that retaliate on every single stage. So no matter what, if you're attacking him, he's gonna hit you back. And this could be brutal for allies throughout all stages of the game. It could be brutal for your hero. Just every single time you do small instances of damage, he's gonna hit you back for 1. So it may not be worth it, right? If you have an ally with 1 attack, if they hit him for 1, they hit the ally back for 1 because of the retaliate. And his mechanic here is that he's always trying to get out these minions against you because that's kind of Zola's just mechanic. And he's a mad doctor. And then the main scheme has ways to get out some minions, whether you put them into play against you. After there's test counters, like 3 test counters on here. So yeah, I mean, Zola can definitely swarm you. He has a lot of mid-range, like mid-hit point type of minions here with 4 hit points here and toughness. 5 hit points on Zola's mutate. 3 hit points on the Berserk mutate, but he has quick strike, right? So they all have some sort of like nasty type of thing, and they all have over 2 hit points, so they're not the easiest minions to kill, and that can make the scenario pretty brutal. So I think on standard, he's a little bit easier to rush down because he only has 12 hit points and then 14. But on expert, I mean, it's very difficult to rush down because some of the minions here have, I think there's a way for him to give minions guard. Oh yeah, he has, where is this thing? He has these attachments for the minions where they get like buffs, like +2 hit points and retaliate. And he has one where, let me see. Does he have one where he gives him guard? Oh yeah, this one right here. The defensive, oh right here, the defensive programming attachment gets +2 hit points and gains guard. So then you have to go through his minions, and if these cards come out in the wrong time, where if you're rushing him down and you get those minions, then he could completely cancel out the rush right there. But I think on standard he's a little bit easier to rush just because the hit points are much lower. But on expert mode it's gonna be a little bit more difficult. So Zola, I mean, he's definitely one of the more difficult villains in the game. Would I put him in A tier though? I think compared to Klaw, and yeah, I think for now we're gonna go ahead and put him in the A tier. I'm not sure if we're gonna keep him there, but I think throughout standard and on expert he is gonna be a more challenging type of villain. Yeah, I mean his stats don't go that much more, but having that retaliate on that first stage can be very, very detrimental when you're playing him, even on standard, because he's always paying you back for damage, and you may not be able to accumulate enough damage against him to like avoid a lot of retaliate damage, especially throughout the course of a game. So I think he can definitely be, yeah, I'm gonna put him in A tier here. He's definitely where the Rise of Red Skull starts to ramp up a little bit. And then for his main schemes, I mean, he has 2 main schemes here, 6 threat threshold and 8 threat threshold. So you can flip down on him, and that's kind of what I like to do. Try to flip down on him, and then like recover. Make sure that I can get all my extra resources and stuff with your extra hand size and alter ego before you flip back over and have to take a bunch of retaliate damage again with stages here. But yeah, I think he can definitely be a challenge. And then for the capstone villain of the Rise of the Red Skull, we have the Red Skull himself here. So Red Skull, he gets +1 attack for each side scheme that's in play, and his mechanic is that he has a side scheme deck, and you create the side scheme deck with all the side schemes that are in the encounter set, and every single turn with the main schemers, after resolving step 1 of the villain phase, you review the top card of the side scheme deck and put it into play. So Red Skull is always going to have at least +1 attack, right? Because there's always going to be one side scheme play when the villain phase begins. So he's at most 1 here. This one he has, or at minimum 1 here. For this one he has at minimum 2, and this one he has minimum 3 attacks. So even though his stat line says 0, 1, 2, it's actually 1, 2, 3. And his scheme is very, very high. He already has 3 scheme on his second stage, and then on his third stage, I mean, it's going to be a lot more brutal. I think Red Skull is a pretty challenging villain. I'm going to put him on the A tier as well. And I think evaluating Zola for standard and expert, I'm going to put Zola actually slightly above Red Skull because the minions there are a lot more difficult to handle, I think, than Red Skull's minions. And the retaliate from Zola could just ping off so much damage throughout the course of the game. Where Red Skull, all you gotta really do is manage his side schemes. I think Expert Red Skull is a lot more comparable to Expert Zola, but I think that having that retaliate on all 3 stages, especially if you're playing a standard game, having to deal with retaliate can be a lot more difficult. So, but overall, Red Skull is still a difficult challenge, so I am gonna put him here in the A tier. Okay, next we have Kang the Conqueror out. And Kang the Conqueror, okay, this is going to be a scenario that I think really ramps up in multiplayer. I think in solo, Kang is decently easy, but in multiplayer, he gets a lot harder. And I think it makes sense based on his mechanic because basically on his so his stage 1 here, you just face him, and on stage 2 he sets the area into 4 different game areas depending on the amount of players that are playing, right? So if you're playing 2-player, there's 2 separate game areas, 3 players are 3, and a 4 then there's 4 game areas, right? And each player is facing one king, and you cannot help another player. So it really separates all the players there, and you have to just kind of go with your own thing. So if you're like, I don't know, you're playing a hero or a deck that's concentrated in only like thwarting or only attacking, and you have your allies help you out. If you have like another designated player that's supposed to be playing protection and protecting everyone, now you cannot have that player protect for you because they're in a separate game area. And if you're playing an all damage deck, you might have trouble mitigating the threats on the side schemes. And if you're playing an all thwarting deck, then you may have difficult dealing damage to Kang or getting rid of his minions, right? So he can really mess up the game plan by separating the game area. I think even on stage 1 on multiplayer, I find that he's just a lot more difficult, and I'm not sure why. Right? Whenever he attacks as a force interrupt, you must choose either place 1 threat on the main scheme or give him +2 attack for that attack activation. And maybe it's something with that of us always choosing to place threat on the main scheme, but I feel like that in multiplayer, I mean, he gets a lot more difficult, and it could also be the 7 threat threshold, which is pretty low for having just one scheme, right? Because on stage 1, if this hits 7, then we lose the game immediately. But even in multiplayer, because he's constantly adding threat, if you choose that option to not give him the +2 attack, he can easily accumulate that threat on the main scheme, even if you are playing him in multiplayer and the threat threshold is a little bit higher because it's 7 per player, right? So it can be 14 or 21 or 28. But yeah, Kang, I think if we're just talking solo, I think he's probably in the B tier, maybe even in the lower end. But because we're talking about multiplayer too, I mean, he's probably going to go probably first for me. And if it was just multiplayer, I'd definitely put him in A tier. But balancing him out with solo and multiplayer, I'm going to put him probably first tier in the B tier, just above Klaw. So far after the rise of the Red Skull and a Wave 2, we actually have a pretty even cut of villains here, like 3 in each category in the A tier, B tier, C tier, and D tier. I think that's actually pretty cool that it's pretty even. Okay, so next we have Galaxy's Most Wanted here. That's going to be these next 5 villains right here. I think even to this day, after all the mutant stuff came out with the X-Men, this is still definitely the most difficult box. So let's take a look at the encounter cards here. So first we have the Brotherhood of Badoon, which starts out here with Drang. Drang, I think, is actually a pretty easy scenario. He has decent stats here, right? I don't think I've ever noticed he has 3 scheme and 3 attack on his 3rd stage, which is actually pretty high. But he has fairly low hit points, being just, I think this is 13, 14, and 18 hit points, right? Yeah, so he actually has pretty low hit points, even though his stats on his final stage are high. But if you're talking about him on standard, he has 1 scheme and 2 attack, which is pretty low. And then he has a mechanic where he gains these charge-up counters on his Badoon ship. So he has an environment right here, the Badoon ship. And then whenever there's 4 counters, then you remove that counters and you do 2 indirect damage to each player. So if you constantly let turns go by, or you let him scheme, and in his final stage he can activate, then you add a lot of those counters, and then when that happens, you could take a lot of indirect damage. But indirect damage is a pretty easy concept to like build around and counteract because you can put them on allies. You don't have to put them all on your heroes. So there's ways for you to strategically place those indirect damage in a way that benefits you, right? Not necessarily benefits, but just in a way that doesn't detriment you as much. So I think he's pretty easy. He has 2 main schemes here, right? So the first one is going to be 8 times player and then 8 times player again, which is a pretty high threat threshold for having 2 schemes. So he's usually not going to threat out. And then the player also gains control of the Milano here, right? So if we look at the contents here, we have Brotherhood Badoon Ship Command. So the Ship Command module set, that's going to be this one right here. Where is it? So Ship Command. So we have the Milano here, where the first player gains control of it, and we can exhaustively generate a wild resource, which kind of gives us an extra boost if we need it, right? The other cards aren't going to be as good. These are bad encounter cards, but having the Milano to start the game off, I think is very, very good, and it makes the scenario a lot more easy because the Milano is always going to help out. So I do think that he's not the most difficult scenario. He has like stuff on his main scheme right here, right? Like you can exhaust the Milano to choose to either remove 3 threat from the scheme or do 3 damage to a minion. So you just have a lot of ways and a lot of versatility with the Milano to kind of play around him and to figure out what's best for you. So I think he's a very, very easy scenario, especially if we're counting him on standard as well. Expert, he does get a little bit more difficult, but he's still kind of easy on expert too. So I'm gonna put him definitely in the C tier as one of the more easier villains. And is Rhino harder than Drang? Um, I think counting standard and counting solo, yeah, Rhino's gonna be a little bit harder. I think in multiplayer, Drang is probably gonna have the edge against Rhino, but I mean this is including everything, just kind of like my overall view, right? So I do think overall Rhino is gonna be a little more difficult than Drang, just because Drang is gonna be easier to beat in solo. You have the Milan to help you out. So yeah, we're starting off Galaxy's Most Wanted, not that difficult right here with Drang. Okay, so next villain that we have is the Collector 1. So let's take a look at him. So the Collector 1 is pretty notorious for being one of the more difficult villains in the game. So I actually don't find Collector 1 as being that difficult. I think that especially at this stage that we are at with the card pool, he's a lot more easy to counteract and he's very easy to rush down. So he has 2 scheme 1 attack, which is pretty low for his first stage, and he has 3 scheme 2 attack, which is very high scheme for second stage, and on his third stage he has 4 scheme and 3 attack. I mean that attack stat isn't to scoff at either, but that scheme is just crazy high. So I can definitely see him very difficult because he does only have one stage here, one main scheme stage of 10 times player threat. So if it hits this 10, then we lose the game. And basically the way he plays is he has this collection. And basically with the main scheme here, let me see, there's, where is it define the collection? Oh yeah, so in setup here, we create the collection game area and then put the top card of each player's deck face up into the collection. So we already start off with the card in the collection. And then basically for the collector here, whenever there are 5 times player cards in the collection, then the players lose a game. So with the lose a game with 2 different ways, either this threat threshold hitting 10 times player or by getting 5 times player cards in the collection. So it's pretty difficult because there are 2 different ways for the collector to win. In addition to defeating the player, right? So if they bring hit points down to 0, you lose. If he gets the cards in the collection, you lose. Or if he threats out, then you lose as well, right? So having 3 loss conditions, I think, does make it pretty hard. And then every single time a card that's put into play, like an upgrade or an ally, when they leave play, they automatically go into the collection, right? There's a way to get cards out of the collection with this hero response here, but it's only once per round per player, right? So if you get a lot of cards added to the collection per turn, you're going to add more cards than you can take them out, which could be very, very difficult. The only reason why I think he's not the most difficult villain is because he is decently easy to rush down, only 13 hit points, 14 hit points, and 18 hit points, and he does not have too many sources of guard and stuff in his kit, right? He has some strong minions here with the Monarch Star Stalker, and he has the Menagerie Melee encounter set as well with those minions in there, but usually you can just gun the collector down and he doesn't have that many ways to mitigate you from just attacking him directly. So I think because of that, he is a little bit easier to rush down, and in multiplayer he's going to be a little bit easier to control. So I think that I'm going to put the collector, he's definitely a B tier villain. I think overall he's going to be more difficult than Klaw, but I don't think he's going to be as hard as Kang. Just because he is going to be decently easy to rush down. Don't get me wrong, he can definitely be hard, but I think that you gotta really just strategize against him and find a way to make sure that you're not putting a lot of cards in a collection or mitigate that, right? So as long as you do that, I think he's a little bit easier. Kang in multiplayer, I think, can be an epic type of challenge. So overall, I do think Kang is harder, but I think in solo, the collector is probably gonna be a little more difficult than Kang. Okay, and then next we have the Collector 2. That's gonna be Escape the Museum right here. So I love this scenario. Collector 2 Escape the Museum is a very like adventure type of scenario where to win the game you have 3 main stages here, right? You have the stage 1 here, stage 2, and then you have stage 3. And to win the game, right, they start off with very high threat, right? 8 times player, 11 times player, and 7 times player. You must remove all the threat. So whenever you so it says right here, when the last threat is removed from the scheme, advance to stage 2A. Same thing with this one, whenever you remove all the last threat, advance stage 3A, and then if you remove the last threat from here, then the players win the game. But if any of them hit their threat threshold, right, so this one hits 11 times player, or 15 times player, or 12 times player, then the collector captures you and he wins the game. So that's kind of his mechanic. It's kind of like a, like a chase here where he's trying to chase you and you're trying to escape. And I think it's really cool. It's a really cool mechanic that you're throwing out the main schemes which help you escape, because it's kind of throwing away his scheme. And then he has a wounded side right here where if you defeat him, He only has, I think, 8 hit points here on his standard mode and 10 hit points on expert. If you bring him down 0, you don't win the game. He just becomes wounded and his stats are lower for 1 round. So it says right here, whenever the round ends, flip this card and then set the collector's hit points back to his current hit points. And whenever you defeat him, you can remove threat from his scheme, right? So right here it says when a collector will be defeated, remove 3 times player threat from the main scheme and flip this card over instead. So I think it's very cool because whenever you're attacking him and you defeat him, he's wounded. So it's kind of like slower, so he has like weaker stat lines, right? And then you can also remove threat from the main scheme. It's just a very fun thematic matchup. It's definitely easier than the first collector, just because there's not that much of like that annoying mechanic. But I think he's definitely still not one of the easiest scenarios in the game. He can be a lot easier on standard, but I think on expert he still can be a challenge. So I'm gonna put him also in the B tier here, and I'm put him behind Green Goblin Mutagen Formula. Yeah, because Green Goblin Mutagen Formula, I think on expert mode, it's going to be much more difficult than the Collector 2. It's just that standard is going to be a little bit easier than that. But yeah, overall, I think Green Goblin is still the more difficult scenario. Okay, next we have Nebula here. So Nebula is the 4th scenario of the Galaxy's Most Wanted expansion. And Nebula, I mean, I say this every single time I talk about her. She's my most hated scenario in this game. I do not like her. I think on standard, she's a little bit more manageable because her force interrupt here, whenever she initiates an activation against you, you resolve the special on each technique attachment, then discard all the attachments in play, right? So that is going to be the saving grace playing her in standard. So I think she's actually beatable and she actually feels fair on standard. But on expert mode, it's really annoying because whenever she activates against you, you resolve the special ability of each technique attachment play. Then you choose in this card only one of the attachments. And then on her third and final stage here, it's even worse. You have to remove the top card of your deck from the game, and then you can choose in this card one of the attachments, right? So, I mean, the thing with her technique attachments is that the first technique attachment reviewed each round gains Surge, and you can review so many technique attachments throughout the course of the game faster than you can get rid of them unless you're playing her on standard. Because you're playing on standard, you get to remove all of them after she activates, but for or before she activates. But for the other stages here, you only do one, usually only once per round because she's usually activating one time. If she activates multiple times, sure, you can remove more, but she's getting more activation, so she's either doing more damage or doing more threat, or adding more threat, which is not going to be beneficial for the player. So I think that in expert, you have to just kind of rush her down, and you can't really do anything. And I think in multiplayer, she's a little bit more manageable because every single player can remove those technique attachments. So she's definitely gonna drop in difficulty for me. Because we're evaluating her in standard and multiplayer, so probably near, definitely in the B tier still. I think I'm still put her above the Collector 1. And I mean, yeah, Kang is hard in multiplayer on expert, but Nebula in multiplayer standard, no, she's still not gonna be as hard as Kang, I think. Yeah, because Kang you actually have to like play. Nebula you can really just gun her down, even if you are playing. In my opinion, the most difficult mode for her is gonna be expert mode in true solo, because you can't remove all those attachments, but you can still rush her down in that mode. If you play in any other mode, you can just build out and you don't necessarily have to rush her down. So she's gonna be easier if you don't play her in that mode. But yeah, I think she's still definitely a very annoying villain, and she can feel very unfair on true solo on expert mode. And okay, finally we have the capstone villain of the Galaxy's Most Wanted here, and that's gonna be Ronan the Accuser. And yeah, I mean, this is a little bit weird because Ronan's not like the most strong villain in the Marvel Universe, but in Marvel Champions, I mean, he is definitely that. He starts off with 2 scheme to attack on standard, which is nothing to scoff at. But then on his final stage here, on expert, he's gonna have 3 scheme 4 attack, just crazy high stats. He has a retaliate 1, super nasty. He has toughness on all 3 stages, right? So it makes him a little more difficult to rush down. And then he has these one reviewed effects too, which is not good for the player. And then basically he has a force interrupt. Whenever he activates against you, give him 1 additional boost card if you have the Power Stone. Facing Ronan is always a constant tug, push and pull for the Power Stone. And yeah, I mean, if he has that Power Stone, he gets 2 boost cards, which go crazy because he can get like +6 to activation. He can be swinging for like 10 or scheming for like 9. And he has so many ways to increase his stats as well, right? He has like his universal weapon here, giving +1 scheme, +1 attack for pretty much the whole game unless you take it off. Phanasm gives him +1 attack, overkill, and piercing. Just a bunch of super duper nasty cards. Even his like activation here, Ronan the Accuser schemes with +1 scheme, or he attacks you with +1 attack. Like everything is just giving him that plus extra. Bonus here, the boost effect here, give the villain 1 additional boost card for his activation with a boost icon, so he gets another boost card. He could be getting 3, 4, 5 boost cards for an activation, and that can really pile up. So I think, yeah, I mean, Ronan to me is the most difficult challenge in Marvel Champs. I'm definitely gonna put him here in the S tier, and I think he is the most difficult villain in the game, and that's probably why Galaxy's Most Wanted has such a bad rap, probably because of Ronan single-handedly here. So for the modes for Ronan, I think that he is going to be the most difficult on true solo on expert mode. And because the big reason because of that is going to be the permanent environment here, is the Kree command ship. So this permanent environment is going to be in play the entire game, and there's a hazard icon on here. So every single time you deal encounter cards, you automatically do 1 extra encounter card during every single encounter phase because of the hazard icon right here, which is permanent. So if you're playing him in true solo, you get double the amount of encounter cards that you normally get per encounter phase, right? If you're playing him 2-player, you only get 1 more encounter card, so like 33% or 50% more, so it's not that bad. If you're playing him 4 players, you can get 1 more encounter card, so 5 encounter cards instead of 4, so that's not going to be as bad as well, since you're already getting 4 encounter cards anyways, and you have more players to help deal with the encounter cards. But definitely in solo, doubling those encounter cards is really, really rough. And he gets easier in higher player counts, but he's still not going to be easier villain. He's just going to be a little bit easier to manage and more fair. And the big reason that is because his first main scheme here, he has 2 main schemes, right? So, I mean, 7 threat threshold and then 10. So it's not bad having 2. But to me, he almost has 1, especially on solo. Because after you get past this first main scheme, if this advances to stage 2B, right here it says, while the Power Stone is attached to Ronan the Accuser, threat cannot be removed from the scheme. So you have to constantly attack Ronan to get the Power Stone just to remove threat from the scheme, and it makes it so much more difficult. So I definitely prefer to keep the main scheme on stage 1, especially if you're playing on true solo. On multiplayer, you can have 1 player do damage and then the other player can remove threat, right? So it's going to be a lot easier to manage in multiplayer if the scheme hits 2B, but in solo, I mean, it is brutal to hit 2B because you have to do damage and throw a move by yourself. So I think that Ronan, yeah, I mean, he's still the most difficult challenge in this game. His most nasty card is going to be Phanasm right here, where he comes in with Fury counters, and his attacks have Overkill and Piercing +1 attack as well. And his card surges. So you get the card, and then it's going to surge on top of it. So it doesn't change anything. It just gives him like a buff, and then you still have to deal with another encounter card anyway. So this card right here is kind of the big reason why he's the big bad villain in Marvel Champions. And yeah, he is absolutely brutal. I think that he is an incredibly epic challenge in Marvel Champions. So if you're looking for that epic, big boss fight battle, Ronan always brings the pressure. So he is that ultimate challenge, but because of that, he's definitely going to go in the S tier here. All right, and then that is going to be Galaxy's Most Wanted. And that time shower here starts out with Ebony Maw, then Tower Defense, Thanos, Hela, and then Loki. So the first villain is going to be Ebony Maw. And one thing that I did not consider that people were telling me in the comments of my last villain tier list is that Ebony Maw does not have Stalwart or Steady. So I was thinking Ebony Maw, so I play him a lot in expert mode, and I think that he can be very difficult because all of his spells here have Surge. So if you get a bunch of spells, it could be really bad, and then every single time he activates, he has a Force Interrupt. Whenever he activates against you, remove an invocation counter from each spell card in your play area. He has this effect for all 3 stages here, right? So these spells come in with like 4 counters on Fireball. This one will have 2 counters. This one has 3 counters. Each time Ebony Maw activates, you remove a counter. So it's kind of like a ticking time bomb on all the spells that are in play. But whenever you get a spell, it doesn't do anything right away, but it's going to surge to get another encounter card anyways. And what could be terrible is if you get Fireball, which surges into another Fireball, surge into another spell, into another spell, into another spell, you can get like 10 encounter cards in one turn with all surging from his spells. That's never happened to me, but that's something that I'm fearful of whenever I play him. That's something I always talk about, of the fear of getting like 5 spells in one turn, because they can just all surge and like make this huge, nasty surge fest, right? But I mean, other than that, yeah, he can be difficult because every single time he activates, the ticking time bombs like decrease and decrease. So I do think he's a pretty difficult villain, but if you stun and confuse him, the activation gets delayed. So that's actually a huge way to counter Ebony Maw. Even though he does have like a pretty high scheme set of 3 scheme, his attack's not that high, only being 2 on his final stage, and then he has pretty weak stats on standard mode, right? But yeah, I mean, if you can stun him or confuse him, then activation won't go through. So he won't trigger this Force Interrupt because he'll never activate if he stays confused, locked, or stun locked. So that's a great way to counter him. I think that makes him a lot more easy. So he's still not going to be a C tier level villain in my opinion. I think he's still going to be a decently difficult villain. I'm putting him in the B tier, but because he gets stifled so hard by stun and confused, I'm gonna put him. Let's see. We're talking about. I think I'm gonna put him behind Green Goblin here. Green Goblin can also be stun and confused, but he just has so many minions. Ebony Maw has those spells, but I mean, if you're constantly stunning and confusing him, he should be pretty easy to rush down because he won't get his activations across. So I think that I'm definitely gonna put him in the B tier. Let's see. I'm trying to evaluate this. Yeah, I think I'll put him here in the B tier, above the Collector 2 and below Green Goblin. And yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit hard for me to gauge with solo and multiplayer and expert and standard, but I think that this is a pretty good overall ranking for Ebony Maw. Okay, next we have tower defense here. So let's pull that up. Tower defense is going to be right here with Proxima Midnight and Corvus Glaive. So it's a multi-villain scenario. There's two villains. We have Proxima Midnight, stage 1, 2, and 3, and we have Corvus Glaive, stage 1, 2, and 3. So this scenario revolves around the Avengers Tower right here, where if there's the damage here, after damage is placed here, it is at least 9 damage here. Remove all of it, then flip the Avengers Tower over to its damage side right here. And it says that after damage is placed here, there's at least 9 damage here, then players lose the game. So basically, you can lose the game through the main schemes threading out, or you can lose the game. Oh wait, can you lose the game through the main scheme thread out? No, if the main scheme thread out, you get some sort of effect, right? So there's two main schemes here kind of in play, right? You have the Under Siege and the Armies of Thanos. If Under Siege threats out, that's like Proxima Midnight's main scheme. Then you do 6 times player damage to Avengers Tower. So just adding a lot of damage on Avengers Tower. And then for this one, you just do each player a face down encounter card, which is also bad. So you don't want the main schemes to pop because they have pretty detrimental effects. But yeah, especially doing damage on Avengers Tower. But yeah, I mean, despite that, this scenario, in my opinion, is pretty easy. I'm not sure why, but just the way it plays, I find the scenario very difficult to lose, even on expert mode. So I think if you're talking about expert mode, this is a very easy scenario, but on standard, it's even easier. And I mean, their stat line gets even weaker in standard mode. And I mean, the only thing you have to be worried about in this scenario is that Avengers Tower cannot recover after it takes damage. So if you put a bunch of damage on Avengers Tower, I mean, it's not going to be able to, you won't be able to heal it back up. So you just got to be a little bit wary about that. But other than that, I mean, this scenario, I'm not sure why, it just goes super duper easy. You have two villains, all you got to do is take out all their hit points, and then they are gone. So in my experience playing the scenario, I'm going to go ahead and put it here in the D tier as one of the easiest scenarios in the game. And I mean, I think, let's see, it's probably one of the easiest ones for me. I mean, I think even Absorb Man on expert mode is harder than this one on expert mode. On standard, they're more comparable, but I mean, I think just for me personally, I don't know why tower defense has always been like just a breeze to go through, and I find scenario very difficult to lose at. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and put tower defense here as the easy scenario in Marvel Champions, even across multiplayer and even across standard and expert. All right, next we have the third scenario of the campaign, or of this expansion, I mean, which is going to be Thanos. And I mean, Thanos is iconic. He's known as one of the most difficult villains in Marvel Champions, or sorry, in the Marvel Universe. But in Marvel Champions, he is strong. He's definitely still going to go in the A tier here, but I don't think he's one of the most difficult villains in the game. Okay, so Thanos, he is a bruiser. He's a very, very high stat line, right? On stage 1, he has 1 scheme to attack. On stage 3, he has 2 scheme for attack. So it doesn't look that high here, and right here it looks like okay, right? 2 scheme is not that bad. 4 attack is pretty high, but we gotta account for that Thanos. Where is his thing here? It's required to put a scenario with the Infinity Gauntlet module set. So the Infinity Gauntlet module set, let me pull that up. That's gonna be right here. Has this permanent attachment set up on the villain whenever the scenario begins, where the villain will have +1 scheme and +1 attack permanently. So no matter whatever you see on Thanos, he's going to have +1 scheme, +1 attack. And as a force response after attachment villain activates, you have to resolve special ability of each Infinity Stone in play. If there are no stones, then you put the top part of the stone deck into play. And all these stones have bad effects, right? Like this one confuses you, this one makes you stunned, this one you discard an ally upgrade or support your control, which could be brutal for whenever you're trying to build out, right? So all the stones have these bad effects, and this stone is required, or the Infinity Gauntlet Mario set is required whenever you're playing Thanos. So whenever you're looking at stat line on standard, it's actually going to be 2 scheme and 3 attack on stage 1, which is pretty high. And on stage 3, it's going to be 3 scheme and 5 attack, which is brutal. So, I mean, he also has Stalwart in all 3 stages, so you cannot stun or confuse him, which mitigates a lot of strategies that revolve around stun and confuse. And he also has toughness here on stage 2 and stage 3. However, so everything that we talked about Thanos so far is super duper difficult, and he is a very difficult villain, but that is pretty much where the difficulty ends, right? Other than that, he has very, very high threat thresholds, right? 12 threat times player on 2 main schemes to lose the game, right? So you have to hit this twice in order to lose. You know, it is nasty whenever this one flips. He's going to snap the Infinity Gauntlet and then force you to remove half of your deck from the game, which can be a little brutal, but it's very thematic and pretty cool as well. But yeah, I mean, he has such a high threat threshold. He's not scheming for that much here, right? Only 2 plus 1 with the Infinity Gauntlet. 3, actually 3 is pretty decent. But yeah, I mean, other than that, he's really just attacking you. A lot of his stones, a lot of his cards revolve around the Infinity Stones. He is going to be a decent villain, but I don't think that he is the craziest challenge in Marvel Champions. So let's go back to over here. I definitely still think that Thanos is going to be one of the toughest villains in the game. I'm going to put him still above Ultron because you have to... Thanos kind of is an all-rounder. You have to be able to deal with everything, right? He has decently high scheme because of the Infinity Gauntlet. He has very high attack. He has ways to stun you, confuse you. He has ways to get rid of your allies, upgrades, and supports. He is kind of an all-rounder type of villain, so you need to be able to deal with him every single type of way. He has some decently strong minions as well. That's in his recommended sets. And he has no minions in his, if you're not playing with any modular sets as well, which could be hard if you're playing a deck that revolves around having a lot of minions, right? So I think that Ultron can be more difficult at times because of that minion swarm. But if you have a way to mitigate minions, Ultron is not going to be as hard anymore. And Thanos is always going to be just a strong challenge in multiplayer and in solo. Yeah, so Thanos, I think he goes first here in the A tier. I think he's a very difficult villain. He kind of plays very similar throughout true solo and in multiplayer. Yeah, I think he doesn't change too much throughout, you know, that. And he's pretty scalable from standard to expert as well. I think he is just a very strong villain, very hard hitter. And you want to be able to handle him. You want to be able to have a deck that can do different type of things in order to handle him. All right. So the next villain in the Mad Titan Shadow is going to be the fourth scenario, which is going to be Hela. So Hela is another adventure type of scenario where you're kind of adventuring through the depths of hell, and you can't just outright rush her down and defeat her, right? Because every single time you defeat her, she flips over to her wounded stage here, where similar to the Collector, she cannot be defeated here. And after the side scheme is defeated, you flip Hela back to her Mystic side, right? And then she works with these side schemes here, where you have the side scheme in play, and then you have a minion, you have Garm that corresponds to this first side scheme. You have to defeat Garm in order to remove that from the side scheme and you know, towards down hell more. And you have Scourge, you have to defeat Scourge to defeat this side scheme, and you have to defeat Nidhogg to defeat this side scheme here. And after you do all of that, then you venture all the way down to hell, and then you can finally get Odin, who's a captive here, and you can free him. And only when he is free can you defeat Hela, right? Hela says right here, when Hela is defeated, if Odin is not attached to the main scheme, then you win the game. If he's still captured and attached to the main scheme, then you do not win the game, and you slip over to her wounded side here. So basically, that's Hela's mechanic. And the thing with her is that she has a very, very high threat threshold on her main scheme. And I think that she's definitely a villain that's more difficult in multiplayer because she has ways to slow down a lot of different type of decks. Because she has stuff that can make you not ready and stuff like that, especially with her modular sets with the the Frost Giants here in the Legions of Hell. But other than that, I don't think that she's that difficult because you can really just play around her and not clear off this side scheme here. Just defeat this first minion, right? Keep the side scheme on here where you only have one acceleration, which is not that bad. It gets even easier in multiplayer because there's so much more threat anyways in multiplayer that one extra threat's not going to matter that much. And the threat threshold is already so high Then you just coast and you just build out your board. Like all the players can build out their boards, and then eventually, whenever you are all built out, you can just gun down all these side schemes, gun down all these minions, and then just gun Hela down as well, right? I think that if you're constantly defeating her and you're just going straight through these side schemes, she can be very, very difficult because the hazard icon here is super nasty, and then the amplify is not going to be fun either. But I think if you just game her and just plan around it, don't go through everything, build out your board, then she's pretty manageable throughout true solo and in multiplayer. So Hela, I think she's more difficult in expert. So I mean, obviously, but I think she ramps a little bit harder on expert than she does on standard. Standard, I think she's fairly easy. So I'm gonna put her in the B tier here, and I think that she's actually, I mean, calculating standard too, like standard like TOO standard as well. I think that she's not that hard. I'm gonna put her. I still put her in front of Ebony Maw. I think that he can be very, very easy if you're stunning and confusing him, especially on standard. Hela, I think is a little more difficult because you still have to get through all those minions on standard and on expert, so that kind of makes her, a less of a variance from standard to expert because those minions kind of stay the same, right? So these minions here that we're talking about, no matter what, they're gonna have the same amount of attack, stat line, and hit points from expert and standard. So I think because of that, that makes Hela a little bit more elevated in standard. So I think I'll put her here. I'm actually gonna put her above the Green Goblin here as well, just because standard Green Goblin is so easy because you don't have those encounter cards. So I'll put Hela above him, and then Klaw, I think, is still gonna be more of a decent challenge than Hela, just because Klaw you can't really game, and Hela there is a kind of like a cheap, more strategic way to defeat her, just keeping her on that first side scheme, and then just building out your board while she's still pretty weak. And then, one thing I forgot to say about her is that she gets plus +1 scheme, +1 attack, and +2 hit points for each side scheme in the victory display. So as you clear these side schemes, they go into the victory display, and then Hela gets stronger and stronger. And if you're playing a deck with a lot of player side schemes, those all go in a victory display, so you can really power Hela up that way as well. But I mean, if you just keep her here on this first side scheme, then she won't power up, and that's how you can take advantage of her like weak stat line here, right? It's just 1-1. You just take advantage of that, and then you just build out your board while she's not doing much scheming or attacking. So I think that's how she can be pretty easy. All right, and let's take a look at the last and final scenario of the Mad Titan Shadow. We have Loki here as the Capstone villain. So the way that the campaign kind of works is that Loki takes, the Mad Titan Shadow, right? He is the Mad Titan Shadow, so he takes that Infinity Gauntlet after you defeat Thanos. We are talking about the scenarios just standalone, but I think that that's kind of a unique mechanic. But because that Infinity Stone Gauntlet that is required when you're playing Loki, he becomes super duper annoying because he already has so many things going on in his kit, right? He's a trickster, so he has 5 variants here, right? He has this Loki, this one, and this one, and all have a different effect, right? This one has piercing. This Loki cannot take damage while side schemes in play. This one has retaliate 1. This one has stalwart. This one has stalwart. This one has 3 scheme, and this one has 3 attack, right? So, and just like Thanos, when you're evaluating Loki's stats, he has +1 attack, +1 scheme because of the Infinity Gauntlet being a permanent attachment that he starts the game with. So he actually has 4 attack with this Loki variant, and he has 4 scheme with this one. And I think that Loki's kind of the villain that I think I'm putting him a lot higher here, because he's almost the exact same in standard as he is in expert, right? In standard, you have to defeat 2 Lokis to win the game. In expert, you must defeat 3. So each Loki variant has 20 hit points, and I mean that is not much of a difference between standard and expert, right? Loki to me is most difficult whenever the scenario begins. After you're able to build out your board and stabilize, I find that he's a lot easier. So I think that standard is probably a lot more of a fair way to play him because it doesn't feel as dragged out. And in expert mode, he feels more dragged out because you have 60 hit points, right? 20 hit points across 3 different Loki variants. So yeah, he has so many ways to change in different Loki forms. He has like these big side schemes here with hinder 1 + 4, so 5 threat. This side scheme's hinder 1 + 6 is going to be 7 threat, right? This one also has hinder 1 + 5, so 6. So he has these side schemes here that are pretty nasty. And each time you defeat a Loki variant, you have to get a side scheme because you discard cards and encounter until you get a side scheme. and then you review that side scheme, right? And each time you defeat a side scheme, you swap Loki with another Loki variant. So he has so many things that combo off with himself. So he's definitely a very, very annoying villain, and I think it's very, very difficult. And I think that from standard to expert, he's still equally as difficult. Um, I'm putting him for sure in the A tier. And I mean, does he? No, he definitely doesn't go in S tier. He's gonna go first here in the A tier, for sure. He's harder than Thanos, because he is that Capstone villain, that fifth and final villain of that Thanos box. Yeah, I mean, Loki is very much cutting close to S tier, but I think that Ronan is like a cloth above Loki. They're just like not even, it's like apples and oranges, right? So I think Loki cannot be in that tier level, but he is definitely very close, especially if we're calculating standard, because in standard he is almost as difficult as he is on expert mode, because the pressure doesn't really change, it's just having to do more damage in expert overall. So yeah, Loki is a very difficult villain, definitely the hardest villain on in the A tier so far. This is the hood right here. So 3 stages, 1 scheme 1 attack on stage 1, 2 scheme 1 attack on stage 2, and 3 scheme 2 attack on stage 3. And the hood has this mechanic called the foul play, which is a special, and you discard the top card of the encounter deck. If that card does not belong to the hood encounter set, then you deal it to yourself as a face down encounter card. On stage 2, you discard 2 cards, and you deal the first card that does not belong in the hood encounter set. And on stage 3 here, you deal each card that does not belong in the hood encounter set. So super duper nasty, because the hood has basically the way he works is that you have 7 modular sets and you set them aside, and you choose one at random and shuffle into your encounter deck, and he has ways to put that more modular sets into the encounter deck, right? So whenever he's doing that, you're getting more and more non-hood cards, and if those modular sets are very, very difficult, then hood becomes way more difficult because you're getting more encounter cards with foul play, and they're not that difficult, then he's a little bit easier. He has 3 main schemes here, but they're all pretty low threat threshold, right? Actually, they're not that low. So 5 on the first one is definitely going to be low. But then you have 8 on the second one here, and you have 10 on the third one here. The only bad thing is that each one, they have effects that kind of ramp up, right? So on the first one here, when reviewed, you must resolve the hood's foul play. That's not that bad. It only happens once whenever you review this main scheme. On stage 2, when reviewed, you must resolve the hood's foul play. And then everyone, if you're not dealing an encounter card, you get a face on encounter card, or no, you place 2 threat on here, which could immediately pop it because it starts off with 2 anyways. If you have like a lot of players and he's scheming again. Stage 3, after resolving step 1 in the villain phase, each player must resolve the hood's foul play ability in player order. So this one, if you get to here, not only do you have way more encounter sets, but the hood really ramps up because you're constantly resolving that foul play ability and getting so many encounter cards per turn. And I think the hood, I mean, I think in solo, he's probably easier because you can rush him down. In multiplayer, there's just so many more encounter cards. Like per player, he has more chances to give you more encounter cards with more foul play activations, right? Triggering the special. So yeah, I think that he can definitely ramp up and be a difficult challenge depending on the amount of modular sets that you have in there, and if they're more difficult ones. So the hood, I'm gonna put him in the B tier, and he's gonna be a little bit hard to rank just because he needs more difficult modular sets, and he's kind of easier to rush down. So I'm gonna put him here above Hela and behind Klaw. I think Klaw is still a good challenge, and the hood has a high variance, right? I think he can be super duper easy if you're playing him like on standard and you're playing him with super duper weak modular sets, because you get to choose any 7, right? So you can't just choose an easier one. But if you choose like the hardest modular sets, I mean, he can definitely be like a top tier, A tier villain here. Maybe even harder than Loki if he has those difficult type of modular sets in there, right? And he's constantly getting them as well. So yeah, I mean, the hood, he's a little bit hard to rank. I'm just putting him here in the middle of B tier just because of that variance from him being either super duper easy or super hard or anywhere in between depending on his modular sets. All right, and then next we're going to move on here to the Sinister Motives, which we already have put out here, the Sinister Motives expansion right here. So the first scenario of the Sinister Motives expansion is going to be Sandman here. And Sandman, so Sandman I don't think is the most difficult villain in the game, but he does kind of put you on a timer, right? He has the city streets environment where it feels like quicksand, and you're constantly placing sand counters on there. And then you can exhaust a character you control to remove sand counters equal to character's attack, but it's only once per round per player. So if you build sand counters faster than you can get rid of them, then it could be really nasty. And after an acceleration token is placed on this scheme, you do 300 damage to your first player. and these Surging Sands will constantly mill out the encounter deck here, right? You discard cards from the encounter deck equals the number of sand encounters here, and it can trigger multiple times per turn. So, I mean, Sandman overall, though, he is fairly straightforward because he only has one scheme. I think that's the big loophole whenever I'm facing Sandman is that I like to flip down to let him scheme. 9 threat threshold is on only one main scheme is a little bit uh, worrisome because there's only one main scheme, but 9 is a pretty decent size for a villain having one scheme. So I think that he's not too bad to deal with. And then his force interrupt here is only whenever he attacks, so it won't trigger whenever he's scheming. And basically, his attacks do indirect damage here because it's sand, so all the sand goes everywhere, which is a pretty cool mechanic. And on a stage 3 here, whenever he attacks, his attack gains overkill instead, which could be pretty annoying because you can't block with allies. Basically, his whole thing is that he stops you from blocking a lot with allies, which can be difficult because allies are the strongest card type in the game. So preventing that type of strategy can make him more difficult. But overall, I don't think he's that much of a challenge in standard or in expert. I think I'm going to put him first here in the C tier. I think he's still more difficult than Crossbones, but like just in general, right? Crossbones can definitely have one harder game than Sandman with his variants, with his weapons and stuff. But I think Sandman in general is going to be a little more difficult than Crossbones, but he's still going to be a pretty easy villain. So yeah, I'm going to put him here in a C tier. All right, next we have Venom here. So Venom is the second scenario of the Sinister Motives expansion. Venom is a very hard-hitting villain, and he gets so many boost cards. That's kind of his mechanic here. So his force response is after you attack and damage Venom with a card you control, place one face-down boost card on your identity. Whenever Venom activates, right here with the force control in the main scheme, when Venom activates against you, move each face-down boost card from your identity to Venom. So activations include scheme activations. So if he's scheming and you have a bunch of boost cards, he gets all those to add to his scheme activation. So I mean, he could get so many boost cards, and that's where he kind of is difficult or easy as well, because in Venom's encounter set, he doesn't have crazy amounts of boost icons, right? Like this is just a boost effect. Review this card. No boost, or this has 2 boost icons. This one has 1 and a boost effect. This one has 2 and a boost effect. This one just has a boost effect, so no boost icons, and this one has 1 boost icon, right? So he could easily get 2 boost cards that have 0, and then he doesn't really add anything, or he get like a bunch of boost cards, like 5 boosts, right, with all the boost cards on your identity, and they're all like 2, 3, or higher. You know what I mean? So he could be hitting for so hard, like 15 damage, or he could just be hitting for like I don't know, like 4 damage, even though he has 3 boost cards. So Venom has a pretty high variance on how he plays in his difficulty. And then with the bell tower, I forgot he also has a bell tower mechanic here. So you can always attack the bell tower instead of attacking Venom, and you can get this to be ringing. And if it's ringing every single time he would do damage, you put it to you. You remove charm counters on here instead, because he has to worry about the bell tower stopping to ring first before he attacks you, which is very thematic. And increase all damage Venom takes by 1 if you have the bell tower on the ringing side. If you have it on its quiet side, it doesn't really do anything, but you can always put damage on the bell tower instead of on Venom to help you strategize whenever you're facing him. So overall, I don't think Venom is the most difficult villain in the game. I'm going to put him in the B tier. He's definitely more difficult than Sandman. So in the B tier here, and I'll put him, let's put him, I think he can be very difficult, especially on expert, but he can also be very easy on standard. So I think overall, um, I definitely, so for Venom, I've definitely found him more easy the more I played him. I found there's more ways to counter what he's doing, right? He does have one main scheme only, right? And this is 10 then we lose a game. But I mean, 10 threshold is not that bad. He's a little bit hard for me to rank right here. I think I would say, is Hela more difficult than Venom? No, I think Hela's a little bit of an easier villain than Venom. I'll put Venom right here. Um, and I find Klaw to be actually more difficult than Venom too as well. Uh, yeah, don't get me wrong, Venom can definitely be harder, but I think taking everything, um, you know, in totality, in multiplayer and solo, actually in multiplayer, I think Venom is a little more difficult because all those boost cards are different identities, and he decks out a lot faster. But yeah, I think Venom's easier on solo, but in multiplayer, I'm gonna actually bump him up a little bit. I'm gonna put him here, harder, more difficult than Klaw. Claw for me is almost the same from solo to multiplayer, And Venom, I think, gets much more difficult in multiplayer. Um, yeah, if it was just standard or standard and solo, I'll put him below Klaw. But I think I'll put him right here, right under the Collector 1 and above Klaw in difficulty. All right, next we have Mysterio. That's scenario number 3. That's the hood. Okay, so of the Sinister Motives campaign, so Mysterio here. Mysterio is a very thematic villain. He does this thing where he puts encounter cards into your player deck, and that is one of the most annoying things, in my opinion, whenever I'm playing a scenario. So he's definitely very annoying. But his thing is, his encounter cards are not that rough, right? So, for example, you have the Shifting Apparition here. It's just a 1 scheme, 1 attack, 1 hit point minion with guard, right? I mean, it has a 1 defeat effect where you do extra damage to him, then you show the top card of the encounter into your deck, but nothing right away, right? You can just knock him out. And there's lots of ways to do 1 damage to an enemy. You have Deja Vu, which whenever you review this card, basically all you do is just shuffle this card into any player's deck, and you can just take a damage or place it on the main scheme. You can choose, right? He has so many ways for the player to choose how they want to, take nasty things. Fearmonger, you just card your hand, draw up to your hands, and it just surges, right? So it doesn't really do anything on itself. It might even help you out. So, I mean, even though he's dealing you all these encounter cards and put them into your deck where you have to review. So let me read the main scheme here. So it says, whenever you would draw or discard an encounter card from your deck, you deal it to yourself as face on encounter card instead, and you draw a card, right? So that could be nasty, but because the overall difficulty of his encounter cards and the quality of each card is not that bad, Mysterio is a pretty decently easy villain. I think he can definitely be difficult on expert mode, and especially in the campaign mode, but we're not really talking about the campaign here. We're just kind of talking about standalone scenarios, and his stat line is not super duper high. I'm going to put him, I think he's around Sandman level. Um, and I mean, I play games where I feel like he's hard. I play games where I feel like he's easier. I'm going to go ahead and just put him, let's put him beneath Sandman, because I think that he presents so many decision making opportunities for the player for you to really pick the best strategy for you, right? You can pick the one where it hurts you the least. You can pick the option that's not that bad. So I think because of that, there's lots of ways to handle Mysterio. So that makes him not as difficult as Sandman, just because you just have so much versatility when you're facing him. And in addition to that, he has 2 main schemes here, right? The first one's 8 threat, and the next one is 9 threat. So he has a big threat threshold room if you are facing him. All right, next we have the 4th scenario of the Sinister Modes campaign, which is going to be the Sinister Six here. Okay, so Sinister Six is kind of a weird one for me. So I think that if you're playing him on solo and on standard, I think Sinister Six is a very easy scenario. You can just crush through these villains here, and they're not going to do too much. But on expert mode, I think the scenario gets a lot more difficult because there's a lot of triggers for expert mode. So for example, on the main scheme here, the ambush, you can read the effect, and it says in expert mode, place 2 threat on light end. So there's an extra effect if you're playing him on expert mode. And if you look at a lot of the encounter cards here, it says in expert mode, this card gains insight 1 cannot be cancelled. In expert mode, this card gains insight 1 cannot be cancelled. Let me see. In expert mode, this card gains surge and cannot be cancelled, which is super duper nasty, right? And then he also has the those bots, the lifeside decoy, which is the recommended set here, the guerrilla tactics. Whenever you're playing the scenario, in expert mode, the lifeside decoy gains toughness, and engaged player cannot thwart side schemes, right? So I mean, he has so many different triggers for expert mode, and the surging can go insane in expert mode because of the surprise here. Getting surge, you can just get surprise on surprise on surprises, just surging everything and just having like a crazy surge fest. So I think expert mode, especially in multiplayer, this can be a very very difficult scenario. And then on standard, on in true solo, it can be a lot easier. So very very high variance for Sinister Six. Overall, I think I'm gonna put it similar to the hood here, right? Because of that high variance. I think overall it's going to be easier than the hood. It's just really if you're playing him at a really high player count, and if you're playing him on expert. I mean, I've had a terrible time with him before. Playing him with 4 players on expert, and the surging just goes insane. So I think that he can be very very hard. The Sinister Six, I mean, but usually, it's not going to be as difficult if you're playing him in a different mode. But that specific mode, I would definitely put him in A tier. And I forgot to say, the Sinister Six comes with 6 villains here, right? But then you only start off with 2, and then there's different ways to get more of the villains in play, right? You can get Vulture and Scorpion in play, and then based on which one is attacking you, they have different effects, right? Like for the Vulture, whenever he attacks and damages you, choosing this card one card from hand, move the active counter to the next villain. For Scorpion, whenever he attacks and damages you, stun a character you control, and you move the active counter to the next villain, right? So this kind of work. There's just a lot of moving parts with them, but overall they're not super difficult unless you're playing that expert with in multiplayer. Okay, and then next we're gonna take a look at the Capstone villain of the Sinister Motives expansion. That's gonna be Venom Goblin here. So, alright, we have Venom Goblin here, and if you guys have talked to me, you guys probably know my thoughts on him. I think Venom Goblin is also the other S tier villain in the game. So we're just gonna go ahead and put him here next to Ronan. These two guys are cream of the crop above all other villains in the game. They kind of stand out on their own. They're like the two most difficult villains in the game, and they're similar to each other, but they are a tier above every single other villain in the game. And for Venom Goblin, the way that he works is that he has three main schemes here, right? Lower Manhattan, Midtown Manhattan, and Upper Manhattan. And you have an active scheme, the active glider counter, which starts on one of the schemes, and he has triggers to trigger off these specials here on the three main schemes. Every single time he activates, he's going to trigger a force response here where you have to move the glider counter to scheme the least threat, and you can either choose to resolve the special here or do a different effect depending on what stage of Venom Goblin that you're facing. And this accumulates a lot of threat. This feels like an epic challenge, which I enjoy. Once again, because it feels like an epic, three main scheme. You have to thwart so much throughout the totality of the game to keep everything at bay. One thing I do like in this, especially more than Ronan, is that he gives you a lot of threat threshold, right? These three main schemes here, it's going to pop at 11 times player, 12 times player, and 10 times player. And then if one of them flips, they just flip over and become a similar environment, and he'll have officially taken over that part of Manhattan, right? Like if he takes over lower Manhattan, it becomes similar environment, but you need two similar environments to lose the game. So he must take over two of these main schemes for him to defeat you, which gives you a lot more threat threshold. And Venom Goblin is similar to the Green Goblin, right? Which makes sense because Green Goblin right here, because they're all. I keep on pulling the hood tab. Let's just close that tab. So the Venom Goblin here, where his one reviewed on stage 1 is nothing. On stage 2, you do 2 face-down encounter cards to each player. On stage 3, you do 3 face-down encounter cards to each player. So he ramps up also like crazy from standard to expert. I think on standard, he's still a challenge, but it's not nearly as difficult as he is on expert mode. Expert mode is crazy because you have to gun down the stage 3 with 21 times player hit points, or you have to deal with 3 face-down encounter cards in one turn, which is brutal. And it's per player too, so this scales. So here's kind of my thoughts on Venom Goblin. I think that if you're facing him in multiplayer, he gets worse because he has his activation here. The force response triggers after every single activation. And if you're playing with a higher player count, he's activating more times and triggering off this Claim of Throne or Reign of Terror or Infest the City way more times. So that can be very, very bad. So if we're talking about expert mode and in multiplayer, I think Venom Goblin is more difficult than Ronan the Accuser. I think Venom Goblin is the most difficult expert villain for multiplayer in Marvel Champions, for sure. Because Ronan gets a little bit more easy in multiplayer, Venom Goblin gets even harder. So yeah, if you're looking for like a difficult multiplayer challenge in a Marvel Champions, Venom Goblin is the ultimate challenge. But we are making a list that's kind of encompassing everything. So I think that we have to also take into account that if you're playing him in true solo and in standard, I think he's far more easy. I think that he actually drops down to the A tier, maybe even the B tier if you're talking about just that mode. So because of that, I'm still going to keep him in the S tier here, but I will still have Ronan as the #1 villain in Marvel Champions just because we are including everything. But if this was like a multiplayer tier list, I would definitely put Venom Goblin above Ronan. But yeah, I mean, just facing him in true soul, you don't have to deal with multiple activations. I mean, he'll still activate multiple times, but you have to deal with it like per turn, at least the amount of activations per player, right? It's not going to be as much. And then you don't have to deal with those encounter cards turn 1 if you're facing him on standard. So I think he definitely gets easier. His big nasty card is going to be the Advanced Glider, which is not even in his encounter set. It's in the recommended monster that you're playing with, which is going to be the, where to say, it says Goblin Gear is going to be the one monster set that's recommended to play with Venom Goblin. And Goblin Gear is right here with the Advanced Glider. Attach the villain. After attach the villain activates against you, it activates against you again, limit once per round per player. So this card, if he gets this out and he gets more activations during the encounter phase, this is super duper nasty, especially in multiplayer, right? Because I mean, we played against Venom Goblin multiplayer on expert, and he's activated like he's got this card, he activates twice because he activates against you. He got like an assault or something. He'll activate again against you. And for the next player, if he gets the activation, he'll activate twice on that player. So he can activate so many more times in a game in multiplayer, in expert mode, and with the advanced glider. So he could be super duper nasty. So yeah, definitely a top tier challenge in Marvel Champions in any card game. I think this is one of the biggest challenges in the game, and he gets only harder in multiplayer. So Venom Goblin is definitely a cream of the crop S tier villain. All right, next let's move on to the next 5 villains here, which is going to be the villains in the Mutant Genesis expansion here. So we have this one right here. The first villain of this expansion is going to be Sabretooth. So Sabretooth, he has a pretty unique mechanic here where basically his first response after he activates against you, discard the top card of the encounter deck. Huge damage from Sabretooth equal to the number of boost icons discarded this way. So basically, he's healing every single turn. You want to gun down his stages because if you don't gun down all of his hit points here, then he recovers on you, which could be very, very annoying. So I think Sabretooth is also a villain that gets much more difficult in multiplayer. Because in multiplayer, he has more hit points because it would be 13 times player. And if you can't get him down all the way, then he's constantly healing back up. You have to do so much damage to him throughout the totality of the game to finally get him down. So Sabretooth, because we're counting him in multiplayer as well, I think he's going to go up for me. He's probably going to be, is he? No, I mean, multiplayer, he's A tier for sure. But because in solo, I don't think he's that much more difficult. I'm going to put him in the B tier. And is he harder than Kang for me? I think I'm going to put him actually above Nebula, but behind Kang. I think the reason why for that is, yeah, I mean, Kang is super duper challenging in multiplayer. Sabretooth is still going to be hard, but more of a defense type of hard for him, right? Like, he's not putting as much pressure on you as Kang is, but he is really making you do more work to gun him down because of that constant healing. So he can be hard, and he has the mechanic here with Robert Kelly, where the first player controls Robert Kelly. He's not counted towards your ally limit, and then cannot have player cards attached to him. And when an enemy resolves an undefended attack against you, you do that damage to Robert Kelly instead. So the scenario begins with Robert Kelly being attached to the main scheme here, right? And then after Robert Kelly is attached to Fine Senator, treat his text box as if it were blank. And after you advance the main scheme to the next one here, which is going to be stage 2B, then you get Robert Kelly. He becomes an ally under your control, and that's when you have to protect him because he can take more damage there as well. But yeah, I mean, Sabretooth, he kind of pushes you on a timer because if you don't save Robert Kelly still takes damage every single turn, right? I think it says here, after Zon 7 in the villain phase, do 2 damage to Robert Kelly and 3 damage instead if there's at least 6 times player threat on here, right? So, I mean, you're always putting damage on Robert Kelly, so you kind of have to find him as soon as possible. And whenever you find him, you have to just protect him, and you always have to defend attacks against Sabretooth, or that attack goes on Robert Kelly. But one nice thing is that you can heal Robert Kelly with player cards, so it's not the worst thing in the world. If he does take damage, you can find a way to heal him back up. So yeah, I mean, Sabretooth, still definitely a challenging villain. And I think, I mean, obviously he's more challenging on expert mode, but especially because of that retaliate one in that stage 3. But yeah, I mean, his hit points aren't crazy. 13 times player, 15 times player, and 18 times player. So not the worst thing in the world, but he can definitely be a challenge, especially in multiplayer, just because he has so many hit points and he's constantly healing. All right, next we have the second scenario of the Mutant Genesis, which is going to be Project Wideawake with the Sentinels here. So this comes in with the Sentinel minions here, and it starts out with 2 scheme, 2 attack, 2 scheme, 3 attack on stage 2, and then on stage 3, 3 scheme and 3 attack, which is a respectable stat line for a villain. So he comes with toughness on stage 1, he has steady and toughness on stage 2, and he has stalwart and toughness on stage 3, so he can't be stunned or confused here. Basically, the way this scenario works is that it really prevents chump blocking, and is very, very similar to the Collector 1 here. So the way this scenario works is that you have these mutant captives here, and you can rescue them and save them, and they become allies under your control. And then basically every single time you defend, where is the scheme I'm looking for? I think it's Night of the Sentinels here. Yeah, so Night of the Sentinels is kind of how he wins, right? So it's a permanent scheme that stays on the that stays up there. And after a threat is placed here, there's at least 5 times player threat here. The first player places the top card of their deck face down under Operation Zero Tolerance, then remove 5 threat from this scheme. And then, actually, wait, that's not, where's the one I'm looking for? I think the scheme I'm looking for may be up here. Okay, I'm not sure what the scheme I'm looking for is. I'm sure. Oh, right here, right here. So, Operation Zero Tolerance is another side scheme, and I think it gains the permanent trait when you're playing the scenario. So basically, if there are X face down cards underneath the scheme, the players lose a game. X is three more the number of players. So each time the villain attacks you and you block with the ally, and the ally is defeated by anything. So right here it says the force response. I should just read that. After an enemy attacks and defeats an ally, place the ally face down underneath the scheme. So you get that ally face down underneath the scheme, and then whenever they're under there, there's no way for you to get it back out. So if there's X cards here, then the villains win the game, and basically they win by capturing enough allies, capturing enough mutants, and when they capture enough, then you lose. And this is nasty because you can't save your allies after they're already under there. And then there's multiple ways to get out, and there's not just that, but it's going to be through the Knight of Sentinels that we read earlier, right? Um, if there's at least 5 times player threat here, the first player plays the top card of their deck face down underneath the Operation Zero Tolerance, this card right here. So there's multiple ways to steal your cards and put it underneath here, and when you lose a card to this, you never get it back. So this kind of has um, less room for error, but at the same time, he's not the most difficult villain in the game just because the way that he plays and the encounter cards in it. But I mean, that having that threshold, that small room for error, I think does make it a pretty difficult challenge. So I think it's definitely not as hard as the Collector 1 here. So definitely going to put him a little bit lower. But I think he's definitely around Klaw level, um, taking in standard and expert. So I'm going to put him right here above Klaw. Actually, I'm going to put him above Venom here as well. Just because, I mean, if you are getting those enough cards underneath Operation Zero Tolerance, then he can win the game. And if you're making mistakes and you need allies to block for you and you're losing those cards underneath it, then you can't really go back, right? And yeah, I mean, X is three more than the number of players, right? So if you're playing one player, then it's four. X is four. If you're playing two players, it's five. Three players is six, right? It's still not very high, and you're having more villain activations where you need to block more potential with allies in multiplayer. So I think this is definitely a more difficult scenario in multiplayer too. All right, so next we have Master Mode, the next scenario in the Mutant Genesis expansion. So Master Mode, I think, is definitely easier than Project Wideawake, and Master Mode can be very easy because you have Magneto ally. So in his, I think it's required to play him here. I'm not sure we see the back. Let's see. Oh, we see it right here. So setup is put the Magneto ally into play under the first player's control. So Magneto right here. Let's find him. The Magneto ally is, where is it? Is right here. So the Magneto ally, the first player controls Magneto. He does not count towards your ally limit. He has 2 thwart and 3 attack, which is really high attack. 5 hit points. After he attacks and defeats a Sentinel minion, heal 1 damage from Magneto. And as you can expect, all the minions in the Master Mode scenario are Sentinel minions. So Magneto can constantly heal himself back up, and he's doing 3 damage, helping you take out all these nasty Sentinel minions here. One nasty thing in this scenario is that it says here that each Sentinel minion gains guard, so you do have to gun down all the minions if you want to defeat Master Mode. But other than that, he's not that bad. And then whenever he schemes, it says whenever Master Mode schemes against you, discard cards in counter deck until a Sentinel minion is discarded and put that minion in play, engage with you. Do not give Master Mode a boost card for his activation. So I mean, that kind of works a little bit better, so he doesn't get those boost cards, but you're getting those minions in play. He's just trying to get those Sentinel minions out against you. But I mean, Magneto helps a lot with his scenario. I think in multiplayer, he can be more of a challenge if he gets a lot of difficult Sentinels out against you. But I mean, having Magneto is a huge, huge thing to help the scenario and just make it a lot easier. So I think it's definitely easier than the Sentinel scenario here. I'm going to put it in the C tier, definitely being one of the more easier scenarios in the game. Overall, I mean, it's still, I'm going to put it above Crossbones. I think it can be very, very easy on standard, playing with the Magneto ally and in true solo. But if you're playing him on expert mode and if you're playing him in multiplayer, he can get these, nasty 8 hit point Sentinel minions here with 3 scheme, 3 attack, which could be very, very annoying. So it could be very, very tough. So I think he definitely ramps up a lot in multiplayer and possibly as hard as he can be a B tier level villain. But just taking everything into account, I think overall, including him in standard, I think he's going to be more of a C tier level villain. So I'm putting him right here. Next we have the Brotherhood here. So we have the Mansion attack with Avalanche, Blah, Pyro, and Toad. This scenario also, in my opinion, has a pretty high variance. It's a multi-villain scenario with 4 villains, and basically when they attack, they each have a different effect that triggers, right? Avalanche attacks you, exhaust an ally control. When Toad attacks you and damages a character you control, discard one random card from your hand. And you have these main schemes here that will flip. I don't think this is the more difficult scenario, the most difficult scenario in the game. Each one of the main schemes does have a constant effect, right? So this one right here, the Atrium, each character gains steady. The Cafeteria, each character gains Retaliate 1, which could be brutal. For this one, each ally minion gains toughness, and for the Courtyard, each character gets +1 attack, which could be helpful. So, I mean, overall, on standard, I think it's pretty easy. On expert, it could be challenging depending on how you're playing it, and you have to defeat more of these guys on expert as well. So, I think expert ramps up a little bit more, but overall, this is not the most difficult scenario. I'm putting the B tier though. I don't think it's super duper easy. I think I'm gonna put it above Collector 2 here, and actually probably also above Ebony Maw and Green Goblin actually. Yeah, this can be difficult. You know what? No, I'm put it behind Green Goblin here. All right, and then lastly we have Magneto, who is a capstone villain of Mutant Genesis. So let's pull him up right now. I think Magneto is really cool. I think he's definitely one of the more epic challenges in the game. Magneto has a full response after he attacks you. You place a mana counter main scheme. When there's 3 or more mana counters, you discard all counters and you move from the encounter deck until you get a magnetic card and reveal it. So that could be detrimental to the player. He does have 3 main schemes though here, right? So he has the first one is 5 times player, second one 6 times player, and then the third one 7 times player. So he does have, it's you can't let him scheme out and then he'll just get to the next main scheme. So the threat threshold is not that bad, but each one of them is pretty low, right? 5, 6, and 7 are very, very low numbers. So you still want to be worried about that whenever he's scheming, and it could be bad. So yeah, and then the way I like to play Magneto is that he does not get a mana counter for scheming. So I love flipping down on him, try to mitigate his threat, because whenever he schemes, he won't get those mana counters, which could ramp up like crazy. Magneto is also a villain that I think ramps up in multiplayer because he gets more attack activations. So he's attacking more, he's getting more mana counters, and then the mana counter threshold is still going to be 3. Right here on the main scheme, there's 3 mana counters, even in multiplayer. So he's revealing more magnetic cards on you, which could be very, very bad because it's more encounter cards. So Magneto is definitely a very, very tough challenge in Marvel Champions. I'm going to put him in the A tier here. And I believe for my last tiers, I had him above Loki. I don't, he's hard to say here. So I think what I was just thinking just now was that I would have Loki above Magneto because I think that Loki on standard is more difficult than Magneto on standard because Magneto has weaker stats here on standard, and he doesn't start with an encounter card. On expert here, he deals you an encounter card to start off the game, and then he does that again on his 3rd stage here. So I think expert or standard Loki is easier than standard Magneto, but I think Loki in multiplayer is easier than Loki in solo. And for Magneto, he is definitely much harder in multiplayer because of those mana counters, not really scaling that much for multiplayer, or scaling with his activations. I mean, and more activations mean more mana counters, and then the threshold for them don't scale with multiplayer, right? So it stays 3 in solo and it stays for 3 in a multiplayer. So I think because of that, he's revealing more encounter cards in multiplayer, and that'll make it more difficult. So I will still put Magneto as the 3rd toughest villain in Marvel Champions, above Loki and number 1 here in the A tier. But yeah, but he's also he's also definitely that epic grand challenge in Marvel Champions too. But he's just a clear cut below Ronan and Venom Goblin in pure difficulty, but still a very fun and difficult challenge in the game. All right, so next we have Mojo Mania's expansion here. It's like a mini campaign with Magog, Spyro, and Mojo. So let's go ahead and pull that up here. So Mojo Mania, the first scenario is going to be Magog here. Magog, in my opinion, is not super duper difficult. So basically, the way that his scenario works is that you have an arena, and basically the players win whenever we're here the challenger side. We flip this card over to the cheering side of the crowd, and then if we get 10 ratings counters per players, then the players win the game. To lose, the champion gets at least 10 ratings counters on his side, then he wins the game. So basically, we're trying to get those rating counters and get the crowd cheering for us versus the crowd cheering for Magog. And also, if Magog knocks you out, then you lose. But if we knock Magog out, all you do is just get ratings counter. So we have to constantly defeat him. He has 10 times player hit points. I think he definitely gets more difficult in multiplayer just because he has more hit points, and you have to really collaborate to knock him out. 10 hit points is not that bad, but 10 times 2, like 20, 10 times 3, or 10 times 4 is definitely a lot more. But same thing, you also get more ratings counters removed, right? 3 times the amount of players. So Magog, I think it's a very fun and unique scenario in the game. He definitely goes into B tier for me, a pretty average type of villain. Not super duper easy, but definitely not super duper difficult either. And yeah, I think he goes around here. He's going to scale harder in multiplayer, but I don't think he ever gets harder than Sinister modes, especially on expert mode and in multiplayer. I'm going to put Magog. I think he's harder than Green Goblin overall, but not as hard as Hela. So I think this is a good spot for him. Yeah. Okay, so next we have Spiral. That's not right. We have Mojo Man next. So we're looking at Spiral here. And Spiral has a very unique mechanic as well. I think Mojo Man has some of the more unique mechanics in the game. So for Spiral, she cannot take damage whenever or be stunned. Threat cannot be removed from the main scheme. And then when Spiral would attack, she schemes instead. And then whenever you get her to her corner side, she has this corner card right here, and you have this show deck. Basically, whenever you can remove all threat from insert your Spiral, then you you review the top card of the show deck and place 3 more threat on here times player, and you just constantly do that until you get her to her corner side. When you get her corner, then she'll flip over to this corner side here where you can finally do damage. Sorry, not do damage. Sorry. Oh yeah, you can do damage to Spiral finally because she can take damage, and you can also remove threat from the main scheme. So you have to time all your things to remove threat from the main scheme and do damage here while she's on her corner side here. And the main scheme has a very, very high threat threshold with 15 times player, which is very high. But at the same time, you really have to time when you're removing threat because you're not able to remove threat from her if she is on her escape side here. So you gotta plan that well. But other than that, she's not that difficult of a villain. I think in multiplayer she gets even easier. And yeah, I mean she scales pretty decently from standard to expert. I'm gonna put her. I think she's easier than Magog. I think she's easier than Green Goblin as well. I'll put her. Yeah, she can be very, very easy, especially in multiplayer, having more help as well. So we're gonna put her here. Actually, let's put her. I'm actually gonna put her in C tier. I think if you're playing her in standard and in multiplayer, I mean, there's just so many ways to help. Because you have more people helping you remove threat, so you can really get that threat off of here. Even though it does scale with the players, you have more players to help you remove that threat. And then, I mean, getting her down to her side, being able to do damage, you can have one player do all the damage that they need on her, one player remove threat from the main scheme. So there's just more ways for you to contribute and to always be doing something against her, right? So I think in multiplayer and standard, she becomes decently easy, and I think that averages out to around the C tier here. She's definitely one of the more easier villains in the game. And lastly, we have the Capstone villain, Mojo here, of the Mojo Mania scenario pack. So Mojo, I think, is very, very fun. He goes at his own pace, and you kind of have to play along with him, right? You can't just take all your time building, because whenever he decks out, depending on whenever, so after the encounter deck resets, there are no set-aside monster sets remaining, the players lose the game. Otherwise, flip this card over. So each time he decks out, he gets a monster set into the encounter deck, and there's no more, then you lose the game. So you are kind of put on a timer. You can't just take your time building. You do have to get him down. He has 25 hit points times player on his final stage, which is a lot of hit points, especially multiplayer. It's 16, 18, and 25, which is pretty high counts. And he has up to 4 scheme here, which is decently high. At the same time, his threat threshold on his main scheme is very, very high, being 25. But he has so many ways to put threat on the main scheme, right? He puts threat on your player. If you are to, right here, let me see, where's the one where, I think it's on the main scheme here. So whenever a character flips or leaves play, move all the threat from that character to the scheme. So there's so many ways for him to add threat. You really need a lot of threat move, and this starts off with 10 times player here as well. So there's just so many threat, so much threat. You can't really mitigate it. You have to have high threat accounts in your play group when you're playing against Mojo. So I think Mojo is a decently difficult villain. I think he can get very difficult, especially in multiplayer and in expert mode. So I'm gonna put him here in the A tier. And I think, I mean, if you're playing him on solo and standard, he's very, very easy. Multiplayer, he does get more difficult, at least in my experience. I'm gonna put him, above Zola and behind Ultron here. I think that's a good spot for Mojo. Yeah, just because he won't feel as hopeless as Ultron, especially in true solo. Depending on the type of deck that you have, you don't need a specific deck when you're facing Mojo. You just really need to follow his pacing and make good decisions whenever you're facing him. So I think that's where Mojo lies for me. All right, so that's gonna wrap up the Mojo Mania campaign. We have two more big expansions left, and then we're gonna be done with this list. So next we got Next Evolution, which starts out with Morlock Siege. So Morlock Siege has these Marauder minions right here, or villains right here. So Arc-like, Blockbuster, Chimera, Grey Crow, Harpoon, Riptide, and Vertigo. There's 7 minions here, and then basically you don't face all of them. You have the side A here for standard, and then side B for expert mode. And then I believe you put Routed into play, and you shuffle them up, and you get, yeah, so if there are 3 villains underneath Rod, then players win the game. So all you need to do is defeat 3 of them, and you can win the game. This is a pretty easy scenario, and in my opinion, even on expert, it's pretty easy, but it gets even easier on standard. It's very, very straightforward. All you gotta do is just defeat these villains one by one, right? They have, 11 hit points here, 9 hit points here. They don't have that many hit points, so you can really just gun them down in just 3 stages. So you just run them all down, and you just win the game. So it's not that bad. You have 2 main schemes here, so you do have some time to flip down if you need to. Yeah, and then let me see. After resolve step 1 of villain face, yeah, you get these knock counters here as well. If there's 3 knock counters, you advance to stage 2B, and then yeah, I mean it's not the biggest thing in the world. If there's 3 villains on your route and players win a game, you can ideally win this on stage 1 and keep it there. Although it would take 3 turns, which could be very, very difficult, but I mean that can even be done. So yeah, you get Morlock Siege minions here as well, which only help the player out too. So yeah, and then they get toughness too, depending on like your rewards if you're doing a lot of good stuff during the scenario. So I think this is a very, very easy scenario. Gets even easier on standard. So I'm gonna put Morlock Siege here in the D tier, and I think because we're evaluating standard as well in addition to expert, I mean it goes pretty easy. I'm gonna put it let's put it below Absorbment even. I think it's a pretty easy scenario in the game. All right, next we have, what do we have here? We got On the Run. Okay, so On the Run I often get mixed up with Morlock Siege because they use the same set of villains here. But in this one, you're going to face 1, so you're going to randomly shuffle up those 7 villains, and you get 1 of them. And then after you defeat it, they power up here with Hope's Captive, right? The villain gets plus 6 hit points, and advance to main team stage 2A. This effect cannot be cancelled. And then when the villain would attack you, if a Marauder minion is engaged with you, the villain schemes instead. So you can kind of plan around and do different things. Other than that, this scenario is still also pretty straightforward. There's a lot of different triggers in it, but at the end of the day, you're still just kind of gunning that villain down. And they have a lot of their minions here into play with Hairbag, Gorgeous George, Slab, and Ruckus. I think this plays with the Nasty Boys monitor set as well, right? Yeah, the military grade and Nasty Boys are recommended with this set. Yeah, it's not the most difficult villain as well. I find this also super easy, along with Morlock Siege. I think they're pretty interchangeable on expert and on standard, and they get super duper easy, especially on standard. I'm just gonna put it, I guess, like this, because Morlock Siege you can really just gun them all down there. Yeah, okay. And then next we have Juggernaut with Next Evolution. This is the 3rd scenario in Next Evolution, and Juggernaut is a villain that I love to face a lot, and I've been facing him a lot more recently, and I do feel like he's been getting a lot more easy the more that I face him. But he can be hard. I know that a lot of players have difficulty facing Juggernaut because he's not really, he's a little bit of a complex villain in how you want to face him, but you want to try to game him. And I think if you can game him, he becomes pretty easy. So the biggest thing to note is that he has scheme of 1, scheme 1, scheme 2. So no matter what, even if you start on expert here on stage 2 or start on standard, he has a scheme of 1, which is very, very low. He has his main scheme here of 7 times player threat, which is low, but if he flips this, or if he hits 7 here times player, then we don't lose the game. He just triggers all these effects, and basically what happens is that he kind of just attacks you even if you're in your alter ego, which could be brutal because he has very, very high attack, but it means that you can try to mitigate his the threat on here and just allow him to scheme. Because if he's scheming, it's not that bad. The worst thing about Juggernaut is that he has his helmet here, where he gains Stalwart and Overkill. So if he gets +1 attack for each momentum counter on him, so he has a bunch of momentum counters and Overkill, it could be brutal because your allies, if they block for you, the Overkill will go over to you and you take a bunch of damage, right? He has 2 attack, 3 attack, and 4 attack, which is very, very high attack, which makes sense for his character. And in order to flip his helmet, he has to spend 3 resources of the same type to remove each momentum counter from Juggernaut and flip his card over to its exposed side, where he takes 1 additional damage from each momentum resource card. And if he schemes, then he flips his card back over to the helmet side where it's not exposed. The worst thing about Juggernaut, in my opinion, is going to be, let's see, Trample is pretty bad. But let's see, Cytorox Exemplar is a pretty bad card. If Juggernaut exposes in play, you flip this card over and then place 1 momentum counter on Juggernaut. So basically, if you spend 3 resources to flip his helmet over to here and expose it, he can immediately get his helmet back if he gets this as an encounter card, which could be brutal. And then Trample here, take 2 indirect damage in Alter Ego, or in hero form, he attacks the ally with the fewest remaining hit points. So you have to play a scenario with Hope Summers, and if Hope Summers leaves play because she's an ally, then the players lose a game. So Trample is a great way to, if your hero is already exhausted because you made a base defense, it goes straight for Hope Summers, and if he attacks Hope Summers 1 time, she pretty much dies because she has 3 hit points here. He has minimum 2 hit points in his stage 2, and if he gets a boost of 1, then he's going to do 3 damage, right? So, yeah, I mean, this card could also be a very quick game ender. So Juggernaut is definitely still going to be a challenge here. I think I had him in the A tier before, but I'm going to drop him down to B tier just because letting him scheme, I think, makes him a lot easier. And being on standard, he just has lower stats in general. So you can really just take his attacks and just keep allowing to have the overkill and have, you can play him in protection and just build out your defense where you can actually just take his damage there and survive. So I think because of that, I'm putting him in the B tier, but because of all the reasons I said before, he still can be very, very difficult. So he will go first in the B tier above Kang. Next, we have the 4th scenario in Next Evolution, which is going to be Mr. Sinister. He's also one of my favorite villains in the game. And Sinister has so much scheming cards. He has 3 scheme here in his final stage here. Whenever you, as a first response after a status card is placed on Sinister, including a tough card, he'll often place on himself. You have to place 3 threat on the main scheme, which is very, very nasty. So if you're trying to stun or confuse him, then you have to also put threat on the main scheme. That applies to all of his stages here. He has these encounter cards here, Sinister Schemes, where you get this card, he just schemes, even if you're in hero form. And if he has Sonic Trick, you're confused as well. Basically what he's trying to do is he's trying to superpower up. So he has these superpower attachments here. Where is that? Right here. So he has Flight. He has, where are the other ones? He has Flight. He has Super Strength here, which gives him, let's see, +1 attack, and then he gains Steady. He has Telepathy, where he gains the Psionic trait, +1 attack, or +1 scheme, and retaliate 1. And then the Flight one gives him Overkill, which is very, very nasty, and +1 attack. So he has different ways, and basically on whichever attachment he gets, you might be getting, you might have to counter him in a different way, right? So it's a very fun scenario because you have to counteract how he plays based on what he gets, and he gets random ones based on how you shuffle them. And then if he powers up all the way, he'll get more attachments through these main schemes if he advances them. And I mean, they have very, very low threat thresholds, right? He has 3 main schemes, 2 with 5 times player, and then 1 with 7 times player. This is super duper low because it starts off with already 1 times player. It gets 2 per player per turn, which is crazy. And you can literally just pop it if he plays a stats on himself, like a toughness. Then he has to add, 3 threat on the main scheme. This one he has 2 threat on the main scheme, and on stage 1 he has 1 threat. So there's just so many ways for him to add threats to the main scheme. You're probably going to lose at least one of them, and he'll gain more powers. If he gets all his powers, then he's going towards Hope here, right, with the 3rd main scheme. When Sinister attacks, he attacks Hope Summers instead. Other players may defend this attack. So, he has so many ways to scheme. He's trying to go after Hope Summers, a very fun and thematic matchup, but very difficult because of all that scheming. So I think I'm going to put him in the A tier here. And I play him a lot in multiplayer as well. I'm going to put him, I think because of that, I think he gets more difficult the higher player count. I'm put him here below Ultron here. And I think you need so much threat removal, especially if you're building out against Sinister in multiplayer. You need every player to be able to thwart, and if one player flips down, you're almost kind of screwed in at least one of the main schemes flipping. So I think Sinister is a very, very difficult challenge. You need to have so much threat removal in your group. In solo, I think he gets easier, but I mean, you still need to be able to remove a lot of threat or at least mitigate threat if you're playing him in solo. But in multiplayer, it gets all the more hard because he has so many more activations and he could scheme with each encounter card, and more stats will also give him more threat on the main scheme. All right, the capstone villain of next evolution is going to be Stryfe here, and I think Stryfe is not as difficult as Sinister. Um, Stryfe is pretty swingy. He can go very easy or very hard depending on how scenario goes and depending on what cards you get, right? His stats aren't crazy, but when he's attacking you, he gets plus X attack, where X equals the number of the most common type in your hand. So you're constantly checking that. A lot of his effects deal with that, so you could get a lot of attack or net detrimental effects if you have a lot of the same common card type or not, depending on whatever you got. So whenever he begins a game, let me find the main scheme here. So let me see. When is his? So right here on his stage 2, I mean, when reviewed, each player discards cards from top and counter deck until a psionic attachment is discarded and reviews that card. So that could be nasty if you get like mental transfer. This one's not that bad. After Stryfe takes an amount of damage, attached character takes an equal amount of damage, and this card. But there's other ones here, right? Like this one right here, Mind Trap. Your allies, upgrades, and supports enter play exhausted, which is absolutely terrible. As an alter, you actually need to exhaust 3 cards you control to discard this card, which is very, very difficult, especially when the game begins. This one right here, attach your identity. Increase the resource cost of each ally support you play by 2, which is crazy. You pretty much can't play anything anymore if you get this card out early. So he has so many ways to shut the player down early game. And I think he's very, very difficult if you're playing him in expert mode, because then you start on this stage 2 and you're playing multiplayer. So he can definitely ramp up. But if you're playing him in solo, especially in standard, I mean, I think he's a very, very quick, easy villain that you can easily rush down, because his hit points aren't that high, right? It's just 15, 17, and 20. So I'm going to put him, kind of to balance him out, I'm going to put him just here in the B tier, and I'm going to put him, probably behind Hela. I think he can be very difficult on expert multiplayer, but he's not going to reach the difficulty of like Sinister Six on expert multiplayer. But then if you're playing him in a solo and in standard, he can be very, very easy. You can just gun him down and just rush him down. So he's not the most difficult villain in the game. A little bit disappointing for the capstone villain, but that's okay. He still can be a challenge depending on if you have really bad luck with him. All right, guys. So finally, we have reached the final expansion that just got released, and that's going to be the Age of Apocalypse here. So this is the final newly released campaign and expansion box in Marvel Champions. So we have Unus here as the first villain in this new expansion, and Unus is very, very fun to play in my opinion. He has this thing called Gene Pool. So I gotta find it. Okay, so Gene Pool is going to be the module set, but it's required whenever you're playing Unus. So let's see. So this is the Infinite module set. Gene Pool is a permanent setup side scheme here. It starts off with 4 threat. As a force response, after an ally is defeated by anything other than consequential damage, place 3 threat on here. And then it has minions here that play off of that, right? So guard at the amount of threat on Gene Pool. So this side scheme right here is at least 3. This minion has Quick Strike. 6 is Surge, which is super nasty, and 9 is plus 3 hit points. Surge is kind of the one that we're kind of looking for that we don't want to get, so we want to always keep Gene Pool at least under 6 threat. And then, yeah, basically, this prevents you from chump block with an ally, because if you block with an ally and the ally is defeated, then you have to put 3 threat on Gene Pool, which can trigger a bunch of Surge with the Infinite Soldiers here. And then Unus himself also gets ramped up depending on the amount of threat on Gene Pool. So we see right here, there's 3 threat on Gene Pool. He has Retaliate 1, 6, he has Stalwart, and 9 he also gets Amplify Icon. So it's not as bad as the Infinites, as those Infinite Soldiers there, but it can still be very bad, and a lot of his cards revolve around the Gene Pool. So basically, when you're facing Unus, you don't want to chump block with allies. It kind of blocks you from doing that. But at the same time, because of that, other than that aspect of this scenario, he's not that difficult of a villain. The most difficult thing is that if you're used to chump blocking a lot, you have to recalibrate the way that you play, and he kind of introduced a new mechanic that way, which is pretty fun. He has stuff like this where after he attacks and defeats an ally, plays 1 threat on Gene Pool, right? So a lot of the cards revolve around Gene Pool. But his scheme has an 11 threat threshold right here for hunting Gene Traders, which is pretty high. So I think that you will have freedom to flip down here. The force response after you resolve one of the villain phase, you do place a threat on Gene Pool. You do have to manage threat a lot with Unus, but I mean, it's not that bad. His encounter cards aren't the worst things in the world. So yeah, I mean, I think that he's not the worst most difficult villain, but he can be challenging. He definitely goes in the B tier for me. I don't think he's a slouch. Um, and depending on how much reliance you have on allies, he can be more difficult. I'm gonna put him. I don't think he's as hard as these guys. I'm gonna put him probably just above the Collector 2 here, right? And I think that the way that he plays, it's all around those allies, right? If you have a bunch of allies and you're needing them to block for you, then you're gonna have a really tough time because you gotta do a lot of removal from gene pool. But if you're able to play in protection and just tank Unus's attacks and not take much damage, then he's not gonna be that much trouble for you. And I think he scales pretty nicely from standard to expert, and he scales pretty nicely from single player to multiplayer as well with the gene pool as well. So I think, yeah, that's pretty cool. He could actually be more difficult in multiplayer, but I found that you have more players to help you remove threat from gene pool as well. So it's easier to keep that down, even though you have more activation from Unus. So you may be taking more ally deaths and putting more threat on gene pool. You also can have a dedicated player that's helping defend for everybody, so you don't have to block with allies. So yeah, definitely a very fun, unique scenario in the game, and I think he's average difficulty. Next, we're going to take a look at the Four Horsemen. This is the second scenario in the Age of Apocalypse expansion. So this is your multi-villain scenario. It comes in with war, famine, pestilence, and death, and they each have different sides to them, right? The B is going to be the expert side, and A is going to be the standard side. And each one has, I think, 9 hit points on standard. Yeah, they all have 9 standard, and they all have 12 on expert. And basically, they have these triggers where every single time they activate, they trigger an effect, right? So war is all about discarding an upper support you control, and a lot of his encounter cards will require to do that. Famine wants you to discard top 10 cards of your deck, which just mills your deck. Pestilence makes your text box blank, which is very unique because this is kind of the first time this is really happening in Marvel Champs. There's not a lot of effects that do that. So if your hero really depends on that text box, like for example, Doctor Strange's spell mastery, right? It's based on his hero ability. So if you blank out his hero ability here with Pestilence, then he can't use any of the cards in his invocation deck, which could be pretty unique of a type of thing. And then Death is going to deal 1 damage to each character you control. Whenever you bring them down to 0, they're still active here. They're still going to activate against you. They just won't trigger this effect because they have to have at least 1 hit point. If you want to win scenario, you must bring all of them down to 0 at once, and there's ways for them to heal here as well, which is going to be pretty nasty. But other than that, I mean, I think they're not that difficult scenario. I know a lot of people have had difficulty with scenario, but the threat threshold on the main scheme here is 12. So I think it's pretty high, and what I like to do is to flip down because all these guys are here. They only trigger if they attack you, right? So if you can flip down, then you can get a lot of pressure relieved and just allow them to scheme, and then you won't be able to, they won't be able to trigger their effects. So still a difficult scenario, especially on expert mode. Definitely a B tier challenge, but I don't think they're anything crazy. I'm gonna put them. I think they're definitely harder than Klaw and Venom, and probably Project Wideawake. So I'm gonna put them right here. Yeah, I think they're easier than the Collector 1, and harder than all the other scenarios there. Okay, and then next we have Apocalypse 1 here. So this is the third scenario of the Age of Apocalypse expansion. So we got Apocalypse 1, and he's a very unique villain as well. So all the newer villains here I think are very, very fun and unique. Apocalypse has 4 stages here. Stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then basically the way that his scenario works is that he's trying to power up, and when he gets to this 4th stage here, then if the main scheme pops, then he wins the game. But basically on any other stage, if the main scheme does not pop, or if the main scheme pops, he doesn't win, he just powers up to his next stage. And it powers up again, and powers up again. And on his last stage here, he's going to have overkill permanently, which is pretty nasty, but other ones here, he doesn't have overkill. He does ask that you play him with the Infinite Monster set, so that's going to be with the gene pool that we talked about. So you don't want to be chump blocking against Apocalypse, which makes him all the more harder. He, to me, is very, very similar to the Hela scenario right here, but I think he's much more difficult because of these side schemes. They're not that much worse than Hela's, right? It's just going to have the 1 acceleration, 2 acceleration, 3 acceleration, but the hard thing is going to be those minions here. So he comes in with prelate minions, which is required when you're playing him. And let's find the prelate minions down here. So these prelate minions protect the side schemes, right? You're kind of, instead of Hela, you're going down to, to Deaths of Hell. For Apocalypse, you're kind of climbing that tower to get to the Tyrant's throne, and each stage of the tower, you have to defeat one of these prelate minions here. Did I miss them already? Um, okay, so these are the prelate minions right here. So we're looking at the prelate side, not on their overseer side. That's for the campaign. So we have Mr. Sinister, five hit points times player, brutality, toughness, and villainous. One scheme or one attack. Shadow King, 3 scheme, 1 attack. Also toughness. He has an effect of his own. Abyss, toughness. Right, all these guys have toughness. And in multiplayer, it's 5 times the amount of players, so they could have like 15, 20 hit points, which is crazy. And toughness are super duper tanky. Yeah, and they could be very difficult to get rid of. I think because of these minions here, that's what makes his scenario all the more challenging. And I think he's challenging in solo because you need one player to deal with everything, right? You have to deal with removing threat from these side schemes, controlling threat on the main scheme, and defeating these minions and getting rid of their tough too, right? So if you don't have piercing, you have to spend multiple attack instances to get rid of the tough. And in multiplayer, I mean, yes, it gets easier because you have more help helping you do different things, but the minions have so many more hit points and it does scale, so that makes it a little bit more difficult. But I think, yeah, in general, he's going to be a hard villain either way. I think that I'm actually going to put him here in the A tier, and he's actually, for me, going to go above Thanos. I'm not sure why, but I find him a lot more difficult than Hela. I think he's actually more difficult a villain than Thanos, and he just has so many things going on in his kit. You know what? I am going to drop him actually. So I think I'm kind of valuing this. I kind of forgot my standards for this tier list. I think if I'm valuing him in terms of expert mode for true solo, he's definitely going to be harder than Thanos here. But because we are considering multiplayer and in standard, you, Apocalypse has a beginner mode where you can start on his stage 1 here, right? If you're playing him on expert, he starts off on stage 3. If the main scheme pops one time, he gets to stage 4, and then the main scheme pops again, then you lose. If you're playing him on standard, you start off on stage 2. Then you have the breathing room to allow him to pop to stage 3, and then stage 4, and then you lose. If you play him on beginner mode, you can start him on stage 1, and then he can go to stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, and then you lose. So you can allow this main scheme here to pop so many times if you're playing him on beginner mode or on standard, that I think it drops him down. So he's definitely super hard when he starts off on stage 3 here on expert mode, but on the other modes, I think I'm going to drop him down. So I'm going to put him here at the bottom of A tier, because either way, he still is going to be a challenge because you have to get rid of all these minions here, the prelate minions that I showed earlier. But because you have so much more breathing room with the main schemes and he's weaker on stage 1 and stage 2, I think he's going to be a little bit easier. He's still a A-tier level villain in my opinion, but just having that extra breathing room and having him be such a drastic difference from standard to expert, I think makes him not as difficult. But definitely for expert mode only, he's going to go way high up here. But for standard, I think there's a huge drop in his difficulty. Just because you can allow the main scheme to pop a whole nother time, right? So that's like essentially having, so X here is going to be his hit points. So 9, that's allowing you to have 9 more threat threshold on an extra scheme. So a lot more breathing room, especially on standard. Okay, next we have Dark Beast here. He's going to be the 4th villain of this Age of Apocalypse campaign. And I mean, Dark Beast, I think that he is probably the easiest scenario of this expansion here. And I mean, he has a lot of things going on with him, but he actually ends up being a pretty straightforward campaign. So he has these environments here where, let me find out the environments. I think they're in a modular set. So you're either going to be playing him with the Savage Lane modular set, with the Savage Lane environment, with the special here, where the villain gains retaliate 1 and discard top 3 cards of your deck is a special. You have the Genosha modular set, villain gains steady, place 1 threat on each main scheme is special, and you have the Blue Moon modular set, where each minion gains guard, special the D1 damage to your identity. So when you're playing Dark Beast, you're kind of tussling him for the time machine there, and then you guys are teleporting through different parts, you know, in the Marvel universe, which is very, very fun and thematic. So if you're in the Savage Lanes or if you're in Genosha, right, it's just very fun. But other than that, he doesn't really do too much. He doesn't put too much pressure on you. He has 1 main scheme with 10 threat threshold, which is pretty high of a threat threshold to survive. If he pops this, then he does win. I like how he has high scheme because, you know, he's beast, so he's a genius. And he's a brute as well, right? But I mean, other than that, he doesn't really have too much going on into his kit. I don't think he's the most difficult scenario in the game. And I don't think he's super duper difficult either. I'm gonna put him in the B tier. I think he's still gonna be above these C tier villains here. Or is he above the C tier villains? maybe he's not actually. I think um, Spiral, Sandman, Mysterio. You know, I'm actually gonna put Beast. I'm gonna. No, I think he can be difficult in Expert. Um, I don't think he scales that much in multiplayer. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna put him in a C tier because we are talking about standard as well. I think in standard he's very easy. So I'm gonna put him here in the C tier behind Mysterio and Sandman. I think he's a very easy villain. He can be more challenging if you're facing him on expert, but yeah, we're gonna balance him out with standard here and just put him right there. All right, and the final villain, the capstone villain of the Age of Apocalypse expansion, is Apocalypse and Savenir. So this villain here is really fun. I was really excited to see this villain whenever he was first previewed. He has 3 stages. So, or not just 3 stages, as in like stage 1, 2, and 3, but he has 3 forms, I mean. So he's like your form flipping hero, like Ant-Man or Wasp or Angel. So basically, he has his overkill form right here. It's his Battlemore form where his attacks gain overkill. He has the Cyberpath form where he has he has 2 scheme and he's retaliate. And he has a giant form right here where he gains stalwart. Each time he flips to a form, there's a force response where you gotta, like, right here, when he changes this form, do you want indirect damage to the player? This one plays 1 threat on each scheme in play, and then as he gets to stage 3 here, the effects get worse, right? This one right here, when he changes this form, plays 3 threat on each scheme in play, which is totally terrible on the main scheme and on each side scheme. This form, you heal 3 damage from him. This form, you do 3 indirect damage to each player, right? So it can get very nasty depending on how high he gets. But yeah, other than that, he is a difficult scenario, and the worst card in his deck is in his modular sets here, right? Is recommend that you play with the Celestial Tech. So that's gonna be these cards right here. It's not even a encounter set in his actual kit, but it's gonna be a recommended set right here. The Celestial Tech. So with the Celestial Armor and Celestial Weapon, it's +0 scheme, +0 attack. But as a force interrupt, when a villain schemes against you, this card top card your deck. If it has this on the resource icon, you have to trigger this effect. And the only way to discard this card is to either get the mental resource to get confused and discard it, or get a wall resource to trigger all the effects. So if you're super unlucky, you get this card every single time he schemes. He's just constantly getting a tough stats card or healing for 2, and you can never get rid of it. For a Celestial Weapon, this happens whenever he attacks you, the exact same thing. You can constantly just take 2 damage if you're never discarding an energy card, or just keep getting stunned over and over again. Or not stunned, discarding a card from hand with the mental resource, right? For this one, if you discard a physical, then you get stunned and you can discard this card. So there's no way for the player to actually get rid of this, because not even like Sunfire can get rid of this attachment, because it doesn't have the text like hero action or anything like that. So this attachment could theoretically stay on here forever, and you just keep getting damage to your identity if you're super German lucky every single time he activates. If he attacks here, for this one he can heal 2 or get toughness whenever he's scheming. So this could make him very difficult, but it's not that much pressure, and you are bound to get the things to this card eventually, right? So other than that, he does have a lot of moving parts in his kit, but everything is not that much pressure. All the cards are a little bit lackluster in damage and stuff, right? So here, if Apocalypse is in Cyberpath form, he activates against you. Otherwise, change in Cyberpath form and place 1 power counter on the main scheme, right? So if he's not in Cyberpath form, all you do is just change to that form and you place a power counter on main scheme. That's not that bad of an encounter card, right? If he is in Cyberpath form, which you have a 33% chance of him to be in, then he just activates against you, which is not the best, but then you have a 66% chance where he's not just activating against you, which is always going to be good. So, I mean, the encounter cards, I think, aren't that much pressure, and because of that, he's not going to be the most difficult villain in the game. He also has 2 main schemes here, right, with 8 times player threat and 10 times player threat. So he does have a lot of threat threshold for you to mess around with, flip down to alter ego, and just allow him to scheme and not let it pop. He gains stalwart here, but he can be stun and confused on other stages, so you can still play around that and stun and confuse him if you want to. So there's just so many ways to play against Apocalypse too. I think it's hard for me to say. I think I want to put him in the A tier here. I think he's still definitely a very difficult villain that belongs in A tier. Um, I think on standard mode, is he easier? No, because even on standard, he's not gonna be easier than Apocalypse 1, because of those minions. The predator minions are so difficult to get past in Apocalypse 1. I think that makes him very strong. I think he's definitely easier than Apocalypse 1 if you're playing Apocalypse 1 on beginner, but I don't know if I'm really valuing like a beginner mode for this, right? I think I should just evaluate standard mode and expert mode. So I think I'll put Apocalypse 1 before and Apocalypse 2 and Sabanur as the most easy villain in the A tier here. And yeah, I think that, yeah, I think he's definitely in all stages easier in standard and expert and multiplayer, easier than Apocalypse 2. But he is an epic challenge and does feel grandiose. So I am going to put him here in the A tier above Juggernaut and the other B tier villains. But yeah, I mean, I think he's not as difficult as even like Red Skull from Rise of Red Skull or Zola. Apocalypse 2, I think, is more difficult on expert mode and in multiplayer, but just not in standard because he's so much easier in standard, just having an extra main scheme, basically, right? And yeah, I think there we go. We finally did it here. This is my tier list here for Marvel Champions, um, updated up to what is it, June 2024 here, including all the way up to Age of Apocalypse. These are all the villains here in the game, ranked in what I think is the most difficult there. And if you guys are playing on standard or on expert, I hope this list is still valuable to you guys and helpful for you guys to like discern how difficult a villain is for you. And even if you're playing multiplayer or solo, I just want to be able to talk about each villain so you guys kind of have a reference point of what I'm thinking, and you can base it on your own reference point. I know I definitely don't think that this list is definitive or anything like that. I don't think that my opinion is like the opinion or anything like that. I definitely probably have things that a lot of you disagree with, and there might be things that I'm wrong on. This is just kind of my experience playing Marvel Champions and where I have the villains ranked. Definitely let me know in the comments if you agreed or disagree with ending with this list and what you guys think of this list overall. I'm interested to see where this list kind of lies with my other lists. If you know the expert and standard and being multiplayer and solo kind of change a lot of where I put these villains. It was very hard for me to evaluate them, judging them with solo and in multiplayer and standard and expert and trying to account for everything. I think I'm gonna stick to like certain things in the future, like just keeping it all for solo or all for multiplayer, or all for standard or all for expert. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of my overall list there. Yeah, hope you guys find this video helpful, and I'll see you guys in the next video.